Hello everyone, and welcome to Stories for Sleep. I'm here to guide you through another night, helping you drift into calmness with a story that'll stay with you long after the lights go out. Before we dive in, take a second, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're listening from. What time is it for you? Midnight? Early morning? Either way, this moment is yours. So, get comfortable, let the tension melt away, and prepare to lose yourself in a story that'll leave you wondering long after the last word. Ready? Let's begin. It began, as many things do, on an ordinary morning, except there was nothing ordinary about it. Nothing at all. David woke, as he always did, to the persistent hum of the city outside his apartment window, the faint but unmistakable sound of distant traffic mixed with the softer buzz of the refrigerator, humming a steady, mechanical lullaby. His head was heavy, his thoughts foggy, but he didn't think much of it. A late night of work, too much coffee, another sleepless stretch. Nothing new. He pushed the covers off and swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet meeting the cold floor with a shiver that rippled up his spine. He rubbed his eyes, fighting the exhaustion, and glanced at the clock. 7:03 a.m. He was late, as usual, the same worn-out routine. David stood, stretched, and shuffled his way to the bathroom, blinking the remnants of sleep from his eyes as he reached for the light switch. He barely took notice of the cracked tiles on the floor or the chipped mirror. Things that had always been there. Things that had always seemed like a fixture of his life. The bathroom smelled faintly of mildew, a reminder of the age of the apartment. But there was no malice in it. It was home. He wiped his face with cold water and looked up at the mirror to see the reflection staring back at him. For a moment, it didn't quite register. Something felt off, something he couldn't put his finger on. His reflection was him, but not quite. It was as if he'd stepped into a room where the air was thick with a tension he couldn't explain. David blinked, rubbed his eyes again, and then looked harder. The man staring back at him wasn't him. At least, not entirely. The face was wrong. Eyes too wide, mouth too thin, an expression frozen in a way that didn't belong. It was as if someone had taken his features, twisted them, and left a faint trace of their own behind. For a moment, David didn't recognize the stranger staring back at him. He could see the familiar contours of his face, but they had been smeared, altered by something darker, something older. He stepped back. His reflection did the same. David's heart pounded in his chest. A flicker of anxiety crawled along his spine, and he turned his head, searching the bathroom for any signs that he wasn't alone. The room felt suffocating. He snapped the light off and hurried out of the bathroom, trying to shake the strange sensation crawling under his skin. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself, the exhaustion from the night before. But the image of that face, the eyes, lingered in the back of his mind. He shook his head. There was nothing to worry about. He was just tired. As the day went on, the unease didn't fade. It only grew stronger. The morning passed like it always did. David had his coffee, checked his emails, and slumped over his desk in the small cubicle where he spent the majority of his life. The office was quiet. The hum of fluorescent lights above the only sound in the otherwise sterile environment. The mundane weight of his work pressed down on him like a blanket. Nothing interesting ever happened in this building, and that was fine with him. But the image from the mirror lingered like a ghost, haunting the periphery of his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, the sensation of not being fully awake, as though he was slipping in and out of reality, kept him on edge. Every time he caught a glimpse of his reflection, whether in the windows of the office building or the elevator, he saw that face again. Not his own, the other one. It was starting to feel like a presence, like someone was watching him. But every time he looked around, there was nothing. No one. When the workday ended, David made his way back to the apartment, his legs aching from hours spent sitting at his desk. The cool evening air did little to clear his mind. He was starting to wonder if he was losing his grip on reality. Maybe he was just sleep-deprived, stressed out, or worse. Maybe he was losing his sanity. But no, that wasn't it. He knew it wasn't. It was something else. When he reached his apartment, he tossed his keys on the table and headed straight for the bathroom, drawn inexplicably toward the mirror. The reflection would be there, he thought. That same strange face, that same cold, hollow stare. He hesitated before looking, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out and flicked on the light, half expecting the reflection to look different this time. But it was there again. The same eyes, the same twisted mouth. The face staring back at him from the mirror was older now, like someone had taken a piece of his soul and dragged it forward in time. This time, the eyes were no longer just staring back. They were searching. He could feel them, those eyes inside of him, searching through his memories, his thoughts, his very being. David swallowed, his breath catching in his throat. The reflection moved again, but it wasn't in sync with him. The figure in the mirror blinked at a different time, tilted its head at an odd angle, as if trying to read him, understand him. A faint voice echoed from the back of his mind, a whisper, barely audible, but chilling. It's not just your face anymore, David. It's inside of you, all of you. His knees buckled, and he grabbed the edge of the sink to steady himself. His reflection still stood there, eyes wide, mouth slack. It was as if the thing in the mirror knew something he didn't, something terrible. The whisper came again, clearer this time. You're just the latest one, the next one, and you're already mine. David turned away from the mirror, his pulse racing. He couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller, the air denser. His eyes darted around the apartment, but it felt as if he was being watched by something else, something that wasn't human. He staggered out of the bathroom, but when he passed the hallway mirror, another one, positioned to reflect the front door, he caught another glimpse. His face was there again, only this time it was different. The eyes that stared back at him were not just his. They were someone else's too. An old man with deep lines in his face and a look of terror in his eyes. He seemed to be reaching out, pleading. David gasped. He had to get out of there, had to leave. This was no longer his life, no longer his body, but where would he go? The apartment didn't feel like his anymore. The walls were closing in. His breath came faster, shallow now. His skin crawled as though something was moving beneath it. He couldn't stay here, couldn't stay in the place that was now haunted by this thing, the eyes that were no longer his. With shaky hands, he grabbed his jacket, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked. No, not locked. It wouldn't budge. The hallway outside remained dark and silent, as if the apartment itself had trapped him inside. He pushed again, his muscles straining, but the door remained stubbornly shut. Then, from the corner of his eye, He saw it again. The eyes. Watching. They're watching you, David. And they always will. David stood frozen in front of the door, feeling the weight of it against his hands. The apartment, once familiar, now felt like a prison. It had been his sanctuary, a place he could escape to after long, grueling days. But now the walls seemed to hum with a strange, oppressive energy, as if the very structure of the building was complicit in whatever was happening to him. He could hear nothing except the muffled thrum of his own heartbeat, a steady rhythm in the silence of his apartment. He had to get out. Why can't I leave? His thoughts stumbled over each other, spinning in frantic circles. His breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick and oppressive, pressing in from every corner of the room. The cold sweat that beaded on his forehead wasn't just from fear. It was as though the very atmosphere around him had turned hostile. His eyes darted nervously across the apartment, searching for any sign of movement, anything that might explain what was happening to him. But the apartment was empty, silent. He pushed again, harder this time. The door groaned, but didn't budge. Panic set in. His pulse hammered in his throat, and a thick fog seemed to cloud his thoughts. It was as if the air itself had grown dense with a presence, something unseen but felt. Then, in the dim hallway mirror, he saw it again. David froze. The reflection was there, but this time it wasn't just the strange, otherworldly version of his face that had been haunting him since the morning. Remember, this time, the eyes were different. They weren't just watching anymore. They were pulling him in. In the mirror, his reflection seemed to grow distorted, the eyes widening impossibly, stretching as if they were reaching for him. No, through him. They felt alive, like they were trying to climb out of the glass. He wanted to look away, but something held him in place. The reflection tilted its head, its mouth pulling into a grotesque grin, wide enough that it seemed to swallow the face. Like the figure was more shadow than flesh now. David took a stumbling step backward, and the figure in the mirror moved with him, its smile widening even further. Its eyes locked onto his with a predatory gleam, and in that moment, David knew that whatever was happening to him wasn't an accident. It wasn't just sleep deprivation or a trick of the mind. The eyes had been waiting for him, waiting for me. The thought burrowed into his skull like a parasite. He recoiled from the mirror, his mind spinning with a single question. What the hell is happening to me? He turned away from the hallway mirror and stumbled toward the kitchen, his legs unsteady. The apartment, the entire building, felt warped. The air smelled faintly of something burning, like wood, but too faint, almost chemical. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the image of the reflection that haunted him. But when he looked down at his hands, they were shaking. His fingers were slick with sweat, and a coldness crawled under his skin. In the kitchen, the countertop looked the same as always, neatly organized, a few dishes left out from breakfast, a half-empty coffee cup. But the silence was deafening. The stillness in the air was oppressive, like the entire world outside his apartment had stopped, waiting. And then, as though it had been there all along, the voice came again. "You're the next one. You're the one they're waiting for." It was a whisper, so faint it felt like it came from the back of his own mind. A voice that wasn't his. He jerked his head, eyes darting around, searching for the source. But there was nothing. No one. I'm losing my mind. I'm just losing my mind. The thought echoed through him like an old drumbeat, the madness creeping in at the edges. That whisper, that presence, was growing stronger now. Every time he tried to focus, the words drifted in again, like tendrils curling around his thoughts. The eyes are not just yours. They're not just in you. They were always inside you. David took a deep breath and tried to push the words away. He had to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose his mind. Not yet. The apartment was a cage now, but it wasn't his imagination. It was something real, something dark, pulling him in. He stumbled back into the living room, pacing, hands pressed against his temples. The reflection was inside of him now. It wasn't just an image anymore. It was an infection crawling through his consciousness. The eyes were there, watching, feeling, waiting. They weren't just looking at him through the mirrors. They were inside his head, invading his mind, prying into places he couldn't shut off. David sank to his knees on the floor, his breath coming faster, harder. What the hell was happening to him? The voice returned again, clearer this time, as though it were right next to him. You see them, don't you? You see the eyes. They've chosen you. You're just the latest. The eyes, always looking, always waiting. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he tried to ignore the voice. He squeezed his eyes shut, but when he opened them again, he saw them. The eyes, not in the mirror this time, not in the corner of his vision. No, this time, they were right in front of him. He looked down at his hands again, and this time, it wasn't just the tremors. His hands were changing. The skin was turning pale and blotchy, as if his veins were pushing against the surface, stretching toward the edges of his skin. His fingers felt strange, elongated, foreign. His nails darkened, deepening into an inky shade, growing unnaturally sharp. David looked up, and for a moment he thought he saw something in the corner of the room. Another figure, but it wasn't a person. It was a shadow, a shape, a presence, a thing with eyes like burning coals, gleaming out of the darkness. The world around him seemed to tilt, the walls warping, bending. The air felt thick, suffocating. He felt himself falling, slipping away from reality. But there was no escape. There was no place where he could hide from the eyes. They had already found him. David's breath quickened, but he couldn't stop the tears that began to fill his eyes. This wasn't just some bad dream. The eyes were alive, following him, choosing him, and dragging him into something darker than he had ever imagined. And the eyes wanted him to pay. David squeezed his eyes shut, but when he opened them, the shadow was closer. The eyes stared at him, fixed and unblinking. A single thought burned through his mind. They're watching me. They want me. David staggered to his feet, panicked, desperate to escape, but he couldn't. He was trapped in this moment, trapped by whatever dark force had come to claim him. The voice returned, softer now, almost soothing. Don't worry, it's only just beginning. David stumbled back from the shadow, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. His body felt numb, as though the weight of the air itself had become too heavy for his limbs. The shadow, no, the presence, had been closer than before. And its eyes, those burning eyes that seemed to pierce through him, through the very fabric of his existence, were everywhere now. He tried to blink, but the image stayed fixed in his vision, as though it was imprinted directly on his brain. He could see them, the eyes, his eyes, looking back at him, but they weren't just reflections anymore. They were inside him, Inside his thoughts, David's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, clutching his head in his hands. He could still feel the cold, clammy touch of the shadow's presence creeping up his spine, tightening around his throat. It was suffocating. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against him like a living thing. "It's too late." The voice was back, smoother now, almost friendly, almost reassuring. "You've already seen them, David. They know you. They're inside you. They've been waiting for someone like you." David's hands trembled as he pressed them to his ears, trying to block out the voice, trying to force himself to think, to break free from this nightmarish spiral. But the words kept slipping in, slipping under his skin, wrapping themselves around his mind. "There's no way out. They won't let you go. Not now. Not ever." The walls seemed to ripple. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and twisted, reaching toward him like fingers, hungry for his soul. David's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel it, the blood pumping faster and faster, as if it were being pulled through his veins by an unseen force. With a cry, he stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady. His vision swam, the edges of the room blurring and warping. He had to get out. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't. But where would he go? He looked around frantically, but everything seemed wrong now. The apartment, his apartment, had become a twisted mockery of the space he'd once known. The furniture was distorted, the colors too bright, the shadows too deep. Even the air felt different. He could feel it pressing against his skin, thick and oppressive, as if the room itself had turned into something else. His gaze landed on the door again, but this time there was something new in its reflection, something he hadn't seen before. In the gleaming surface of the hallway mirror, David saw not just his reflection, but others, shadows, silhouettes that seemed to move with their own will, figures that weren't quite human. Their eyes, those eyes, were there, staring at him from behind the glass. The glass was no longer just a mirror. It was a gateway. "They're all here, David. They're all waiting for you to join them." His breath caught in his throat. There were so many of them now, so many eyes. They were everywhere, inside the room, inside his mind. The whispers came again, louder now, filling his head with a cacophony of voices. They were all there, trapped in the glass. People who had come before him, people who had tried to escape, people who had been claimed by the eyes. David staggered back from the mirror, his heart racing, his mind in chaos. This isn't real. It's not real. But even as a thought flickered through his mind, a part of him knew the truth. It was real. The eyes had chosen him. The eyes had always been there, waiting, passed down from one victim to another. And now it was his turn. With shaking hands, David reached out and grabbed the edge of the mirror, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface. For a moment, nothing happened. His reflection remained frozen, staring back at him with those wide, unnatural eyes. But then, something changed. The mirror began to ripple, as though the glass itself had become liquid, as though the surface had grown soft and pliable. It was no longer just a reflection. It was pulling him in. The figure in the glass, a figure that was not his own, shifted forward, its eyes widening as it reached out toward him. The mouth twisted into an expression of malice, something far more sinister than any human could express. David yanked his hand back, but it was too late. The eyes, those eyes, began to pull at him, pulling him toward the glass, toward the darkness that had grown deeper and deeper in the room. He could feel the coldness, the slickness of the mirror, as if it were something living, something that wanted him. His body lurched toward it, and he struggled, but his legs felt weak, like they no longer belonged to him. His hands shook uncontrollably. "You can't escape. You never could." The voice, now louder than ever, echoed in his ears. The presence, the eyes, were consuming him, taking over his mind. His body, he could feel it. A creeping numbness that started at his fingers and spread, moving like liquid through his veins. His body seemed to grow heavy, weightless, as though he were sinking into the very air itself. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped. His mouth opened, but all he could hear was the roar of the voice in his head. And then, suddenly, the pull stopped. David collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling violently. His mind was a haze of confusion, spinning in circles, unable to grasp hold of anything solid. "Don't worry, David. You've done your part. You've seen them. And now, they'll see you." He pushed himself up, his hands slipping on the slick surface of the floor. His breath was ragged, his heart pounding as though it were trying to break free from his chest. He stumbled backward again, shaking his head, trying to clear the fog from his thoughts. The room was spinning, tilting in ways that were impossible. The apartment was no longer his. It wasn't even a place anymore. It was a trap. The eyes were everywhere, watching him, feeling him. They were waiting for him to make the wrong move, to slip. But David couldn't think straight. He couldn't escape them. He rushed to the door again, and this time, when his hand gripped the handle, it turned. The door creaked open, but beyond the threshold, it wasn't the hallway he remembered. There was only darkness, endless darkness. The eyes were still there, watching, always watching. The door creaked open, and the darkened hallway beyond seemed to stretch on forever. David's heart hammered in his chest as he peered into the blackness. The shadows swallowed the faint glow from his apartment, leaving him with nothing but the deep, suffocating void. "It's not real," he told himself, his voice echoing weakly in his head. But even as he thought it, a cold dread gripped him. He knew it wasn't true. The reality he had once understood. The comfort of his apartment, the mundane routines, the familiar spaces, had splintered. It had unraveled, leaving only this deep, inescapable darkness in its place. The eyes were watching, always watching. "They've already claimed you," the voice whispered again, the words slithering inside his skull, wrapping tighter and tighter around his thoughts. David didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his legs stiff with fear, but driven by something deeper. A primal instinct to escape whatever this thing was that had ensnared him. His breath hitched as he crossed the threshold, stepping into the unknown. And as he did, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a tug at the edges of his vision, the flickering of a shadow in the corner of his eye. He swiveled his head quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the cold, oppressive air of the hallway. The silence was deafening, suffocating. David took another step, then another. His feet seemed to move on their own, his body no longer obeying his mind's frantic commands. The hall stretched before him, longer than it had ever been before, the walls bending and warping like a mirage. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground beneath him had become thicker, more resistant. A low guttural sound echoed from somewhere deep in the hall. It was a low growl, inhuman, animalistic, and it froze David in place. His skin prickled, hairs on the back of his neck standing up as though a cold breath had brushed past him. His body trembled, the air growing thicker, pressing against his chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. Then, the eyes. David's gaze snapped to the walls. There, just above the peeling wallpaper, were two pinpricks of light, flickering like dying stars. The eyes, he thought, his throat tightening in a vice. But they weren't just the familiar eyes from the mirror. These were different. These were larger, brighter, more intense, like the sun through a storm. And they weren't alone. Hundreds of them, thousands, hung in the air, suspended just above the walls, their gazes fixed on him. They were everywhere. "You can't run," the voice purred, now more of a laugh than anything else. "They've seen you. They've been watching you for so long. You're already theirs." David's breath caught in his throat. His knees buckled beneath him, and he sank to the floor, the weight of the room pressing him down like a physical force. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the vision, but when he opened them again, the eyes were still there, unblinking, unmoving. They were inescapable. They were inside him now, as much a part of him as his own heart. He could feel them, their cold gaze crawling through his mind, searching, sifting through his memories like a relentless tide. They were everywhere, not just here, but in his thoughts, in his dreams. They had been following him long before he had realized, and they were getting closer. David tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. The air had thickened, had become something heavier, more suffocating. His eyes darted around the hallway, and in the shifting shadows, he saw them. Figures, distorted, broken shapes, draped in darkness, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Their bodies twisted, melted into each other, forming one horrific mass of limbs and faces, indistinguishable from one another. The eyes were all around them, in their sockets, in their mouths, in their very skin, and they were looking at him. "You're not the first," the voice whispered again. "You won't be the last." They pass from one to the next. And you, David, you're the latest in the long line. David's chest tightened with fear as the figures drew nearer. They weren't just living beings. No, they were something worse. Each one wore the face of someone lost, someone broken, someone who had been swallowed by the eyes before him. They moved with purpose, drawn to him by something he couldn't understand, their twisted features warping as they came closer. He stumbled backward, hands shaking, eyes wide with terror. He turned to run, but the hallway seemed endless, the walls stretching far beyond anything he could comprehend. There was no escape, no way out. The eyes were everywhere. They were always there. And then, just when he thought he might collapse from sheer panic, the whisper returned. "Don't you see? You've been chosen. You've always been chosen." David's pulse quickened. The words rang through his skull like a drumbeat, loud and relentless. He staggered, feeling his breath coming in short, frantic bursts. His thoughts were clouded by a heavy fog, but one thought, one terrible, undeniable truth, began to surface from the dark recesses of his mind. The eyes aren't just watching you, he realized. They're waiting for you to join them. It was then that he understood. This wasn't just about being haunted. This wasn't just about reflections in mirrors or strange visions in the corners of his sight. The eyes were a curse passed from one person to the next, consuming all those in its path until they were nothing more than vessels, bodies carrying the weight of the eyes, the souls of the victims trapped inside them. David was no longer just a witness. He was the next victim. And soon, there would be no difference between him and the figures that shuffled toward him through the hall. He could already feel it, something creeping inside him, something cold and invasive, like a parasite burrowing into his thoughts. The darkness around him grew thicker, colder. He could feel the presence behind him now, a thing more terrifying than the eyes themselves. It was no longer just a curse. It was a hunger that gnawed at his bones, at his soul, waiting for him to give in. But David couldn't give in. He wouldn't. The hall around him seemed to shift again, and suddenly there was light, a flicker, a brief flash, cutting through the shadows. David's breath hitched, his heart leaping in his chest as the faint light illuminated the figures in front of him. Their faces, twisted, blank, hollow, looked back at him with eyes that were both human and something else, something ancient. The eyes weren't just watching anymore. They were speaking to him, in his head, inside his mind. And now, David could hear them clearer than ever. "You're not leaving. Not this time. Not when you've seen us." He backed away, his legs shaking, but there was nowhere to go. The figures were all around him now, their distorted bodies closing in. The eyes, they knew him. They owned him. In that moment, David realized there was no escape. He was part of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The curse had found him, and the eyes would never let him go. David's world was spinning. The figures that surrounded him were no longer just shadows in the hall. They were real. They were alive. Their bodies moved unnaturally, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings, their limbs jerking in strange, rhythmic patterns, their eyes fixed on him with that unblinking, knowing gaze. It was as if they had been waiting, patiently, for him to come to this moment. The walls of the hallway seemed to pulse with life. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against his chest as though the room itself were alive, suffocating him. The floor felt like it was shifting beneath him, as if he were walking on the surface of some living creature. There was no escape, no escape. The voice, familiar, insidious, slithered through his mind, wrapping itself around his thoughts like a serpent constricting its prey. "You can't run. You can't hide. You've already seen us. You've always been ours." David's heart raced, each beat like the thunder of a war drum, but he couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. His body refused to obey him. The eyes, those eyes, they were everywhere, inside him, around him, watching, always watching. There was nowhere left to hide. Why didn't you understand? The voice in his head grew louder, more insistent. "It's too late now, David. You are part of it. You always have been." David's mind screamed for release, for any shred of sanity to cling to. But the darkness was closing in. The figures were moving toward him now, their slow, deliberate steps grinding on his nerves, their eyes fixed on him like predators about to claim their prey. They came closer, too close, the stench of decay filling the air. He could feel the cold emanating from their twisted forms, their bodies flickering like broken television screens. "You're not the first to stand here," the voice continued, its tone smooth, almost patronizing. "There were others before you, David. You're just the next one in line." David's mind flashed back to the moments before everything had started. The fleeting glimpses of strange eyes in the mirror, the disorientation, the whispers that had first crept into his thoughts like a bad memory. He hadn't wanted to believe it. He had tried to convince himself it was just a nightmare, that he was going mad. But the truth was more horrifying than he could have imagined. The eyes had always been there, and now they had claimed him. He could hear the whispering now, low, guttural murmurs, coming from the figures, coming from the walls, the eyes, the curse, the passing of the gaze, the endless cycle of death. The words were a chant, rhythmic and hypnotic, driving him into a frenzy. This is what it always is. This is what they all become. A sick realization gnawed at the edges of his mind. He was no longer David. He was no longer himself. He had become part of the eyes. His body was just a shell, a vessel to carry the curse, to pass the eyes on to someone else. He wasn't just their victim. He was now their vessel. The floor beneath him began to warp, the board splintering, creaking like they were being pulled apart by unseen hands. His chest tightened with an unbearable pressure. His skin crawled, and he could feel it. Something was shifting inside him, something cold, invasive. It wasn't just the eyes anymore. It was their hunger. David's body began to tremble, his vision blurring as the darkness closed in. He could feel his thoughts slipping, the fog thickening around him. His mind was no longer his own. The eyes, they were inside him now, guiding his every movement, controlling him. He could feel them, could feel their presence like 1,000 invisible tendrils wrapping around his soul, pulling him into the dark, pulling him deeper into the curse. It's time, the voice whispered. It's time for you to see. David's hands shook as they lifted to his face, as if they were being guided by a force outside of his control. His fingers brushed across his eyes, and for a moment, he thought he could escape it. But then, it happened. His eyes, his own eyes, shifted. The agony was unbearable. His body convulsed as his vision blurred and contorted. His fingers pressed harder against his eyelids, but the pain only intensified. His own reflection flickered in front of him, not in a mirror, but in his mind. He saw a new set of eyes that weren't his own, eyes that had been there long before, eyes that had watched, eyes that had witnessed. The darkness swallowed him whole, and then, in nothing, David awoke. For a moment, he thought he was free, thought the nightmare had ended. But as he opened his eyes, the room was unfamiliar. The air was thick with that same oppressive weight. The walls were bent, warped. He was still in the hallway, but it was no longer his apartment. The door that had once led to the outside world now stood cracked open, revealing only darkness beyond. And in that darkness, the eyes. He couldn't breathe. The eyes were everywhere, in the air, in the walls, in the very fabric of reality. And now, as David staggered to his feet, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The eyes weren't just in the world around him anymore. They were in his soul. He looked down at his hands and saw them there. The eyes, small, watching, but unmistakably there. His fingers were not his own. The nails had grown long, sharp, black, and covered in small, writhing eyes that blinked in unison with his every movement. His arms felt too long, too thin, and his body had become a strange echo of the things he had seen before. David wasn't David anymore. He was the eyes. The curse had passed through him, had become a part of him. The eyes that had once watched, that had haunted him, had now taken hold. He could feel the pull of it, the hunger for more. The curse would never stop. It would never end. pass from one victim to the next, endlessly, always watching, always waiting. David's last thought, if he could still be said to have one, was a broken, terrified realization. The eyes, they had already chosen someone else. The night was thick, with a kind of oppressive silence, the kind that hung heavy in the air, like the world was holding its breath. Jason stood at the edge of the street, staring down the dark alleyway where the sewer grate lay half buried under a mound of wet leaves. It had been there for as long as he could remember, a forgotten relic of the street's past, the rusted metal surface barely noticeable among the weeds and trash that had accumulated over the years. But tonight, something was different. He could feel it in his bones, the way the night seemed to whisper, urging him closer, deeper into the shadows. He'd heard the rumors, of course. People said there were tunnels under the city, old ones, abandoned and sealed off. But no one ever bothered to talk about them. Not really. Too many years had passed since the last time anyone had dared to venture down into those forgotten places. The streets had long since been rebuilt, patched over, and the tunnels were considered little more than old ghost stories. But tonight, Jason found himself wondering if those stories were true, and if they were, what was down there? What had they been hiding for all these years? The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the alley like dark fingers reaching for him. Jason had lived in this neighborhood for most of his life, but it had always been easy to ignore the things that lay beneath the surface. Easy to pretend that the stories were just stories, that the city was as solid as it seemed. But now, standing on the edge of the alley, he could feel the weight of the ground beneath him shift, as though the earth itself were alive, waiting for him to step closer. He glanced around quickly, half expecting someone to see him. There were no cars on the street, and the windows of the old houses lining the road were dark, their inhabitants either asleep or unaware of the strange pull that had drawn him here. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was watching him. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as paranoia, but even as he did, a chill crawled down his spine. He kneeled down, brushing aside the wet leaves and debris, and grabbed the rusty edge of the grate. The metal was cold and slick under his fingers, the paint chipped and worn away by years of neglect. He pulled, grunting, as he tried to lift it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the earth had sealed it tight for a reason, and yet it wasn't the sort of thing you could just leave alone, not when it felt like something was beckoning him, pulling him closer, urging him to see what lay hidden beneath. Jason hesitated, unsure of what he was about to do. But that feeling, the one that had been gnawing at the back of his mind evening, was growing stronger, like a voice inside his head whispering to him, "Just go down there. Just see what's hidden. It's not like you have anything to lose." His pulse quickened as he shifted his weight, repositioning himself to get a better grip on the metal. He yanked again, this time with all his strength, and the grate finally shifted with a groan, the old hinges protesting as they were forced open. The opening revealed a small, narrow passageway beneath the street. The air from below was thick and musty, heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. But there was something else mixed in, something faintly metallic, like old blood. Jason swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. The tunnel was dark, impossibly dark, and he couldn't shake the sense that something was watching him from the shadows, waiting for him to step closer. The sensation made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, but curiosity won out over fear. He wasn't the kind of person to turn back just because something felt off. And besides, what was the worst that could happen? Without another thought, he lowered himself into the opening, his feet landing with a soft thud on the concrete floor below. His flashlight flickered to life as he scanned the small tunnel ahead of him, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The walls of the tunnel were damp, slick with condensation, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. He could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance, echoing off the walls. For a moment, Jason stood there, staring into the pitch-black abyss ahead of him, and he almost wondered if he'd made a mistake. The tunnel felt wrong, as though it were alive in some way, like the walls were breathing, pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. The sensation was unsettling, but the urge to explore, to know what lay hidden below the surface, was too strong to resist. He took a deep breath, adjusting the strap of the flashlight around his wrist. The narrow passage was just wide enough for him to move through, but barely. He had to duck slightly as he stepped forward, the walls on either side pressing in around him. The floor was uneven, cracked in places, as if something had shifted over time, pushing the earth up and breaking the concrete in jagged lines. But despite the age and the wear, the tunnel felt wrong. It wasn't just old. It felt like something that had been buried for a reason. Jason moved forward slowly, the beam of his flashlight flickering in and out of the darkness as he made his way deeper. The further he went, the more oppressive the air became. It was almost as though the tunnel itself was breathing, the walls expanding and contracting with each step he took. The temperature seemed to drop, and he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, trying to ignore the strange, creeping sense of unease that was settling in his chest. As he walked, he started to hear something faint in the distance, a soft sound, like footsteps. At first, he dismissed it as nothing more than his imagination, but the noise was unmistakable. It was too rhythmic to be a trick of the mind. Someone or something was ahead of him, moving in the same direction. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. The noise stopped as soon as he did. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the footsteps started again, closer this time, as if whatever it was had noticed his presence and was now moving toward him. Jason's heart began to race, his pulse pounding in his ears. He swallowed, trying to calm himself. It was just another person, probably someone else who discovered the tunnel long before he had. But even as he thought it, the thought felt hollow, wrong. Something about the sound didn't sit right, like the footsteps weren't coming from the same place, or from the same kind of creature. Jason's breath quickened. He reached for the flashlight again, aiming it down the tunnel ahead of him. But there was nothing there. The beam of light illuminated only darkness, the tunnel stretching on, endless and empty. The footsteps had stopped again. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, the weight of the silence pressing in on him. There was something wrong with this place, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He'd come here looking for adventure, but now, standing in the belly of the tunnel, he was starting to regret it. He turned around to head back the way he'd come, but when he glanced behind him, There was nothing there either. The tunnel stretched out in both directions, and the sense of something watching him, something following him, had only grown stronger. The air was thick, suffocating, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was just around the corner, waiting for him. Jason stood in the oppressive silence of the tunnel, his breath shallow, trying to shake the sense that something was creeping just out of sight, following him in the darkness. The air was thick, a mixture of damp earth and something else, something metallic, bitter. His flashlight trembled in his hand, casting jagged, uneven beams of light across the walls that seemed to close in on him with every passing second. He was certain now that the footsteps he had heard earlier weren't just his imagination. The question wasn't who was down here. It was what? He tried to steady his breath, tried to ignore the clammy chill creeping through his jacket, but it was impossible. There was a weight to the air, a suffocating pressure that made the tunnel feel smaller, tighter with every step. His pulse pounded in his ears, and his feet, despite his best efforts, moved forward. The tunnel twisted, its walls bending unnaturally, as though the earth itself had been shaped by some unseen hand, forcing Jason to duck and weave between jagged rocks and broken concrete. It felt as if the tunnel were reshaping itself around him, each turn more unexpected than the last. Just turn back. Go back. It's not too late. The thought echoed in his mind like a desperate plea from some distant part of him that still wanted to escape. He wanted to listen, to heed that voice, but something deeper, something primal, pushed him forward. He was already too far into the depths of the tunnel. It had him now, whatever it was. Jason's feet carried him without consent, deeper and deeper into the yawning blackness ahead. As he moved, the sensation of being watched only grew. The darkness was dense here, like it had weight, like it was clinging to him. He could feel it pressing against his skin, pulling at his clothes, at his very thoughts. Every now and then, his flashlight flickered, as if the darkness itself were pushing back against the light, trying to reclaim its dominion. The deeper he went, the more oppressive it became. Jason turned another corner, and that's when he saw it. A small, rusted door embedded in the wall to his left, half hidden in shadow. It was a door like any other, but its presence here, in the bowels of this forgotten tunnel, felt wrong. The hinges were bent, and the metal was streaked with rust, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. But it wasn't the door itself that caught Jason's attention. It was the faint scratching sound emanating from behind it, soft, rhythmic, like claws dragging against stone. Jason froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The noise was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, moving just behind the door. Scrape, scrape, scrape. His mind reeled as he struggled to make sense of what he was hearing. It wasn't a human sound. It wasn't an animal either. It was something else, something unnatural. He knew he should turn around, leave, run back to the surface, but he couldn't. His legs wouldn't obey him. The sensation that had been crawling along his spine, the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him, wasn't fading. It was growing. Something was following him. No, not just following him, hunting him. With a deep, shaky breath, Jason reached for the door, his fingers brushing against the rusted handle. It was cold, almost ice cold, and for a moment, his mind flashed to the stories he'd heard about the tunnels, the rumors of strange things, things that didn't belong in the world, people who had disappeared, people who never returned. Could they have all been drawn to this door? Drawn to whatever lay behind it? Before he could stop himself, his hand turned the knob. The door creaked open with a groan of ancient metal, revealing nothing but a dark, narrow chamber beyond. Jason stepped forward, his flashlight cutting a thin beam of light through the dense shadows. The room was smaller than he expected, its walls covered in strange, black stains that seemed to move when the light hit them. He couldn't focus on them long enough to make sense of it. His attention was immediately drawn to the floor. Something was there. At first, he thought it was just a pile of debris, bits of old paper, discarded cloth, something that had been left behind by the city's long-forgotten workers. But as his flashlight swept over the pile, his heart sank. It wasn't debris. It was a body. The figure was crumpled in a twisted heap, half covered by rotting fabric. The flesh, if you could call it that, was an ashen gray, desiccated and dry like something that had been left out in the sun for too long. But the most disturbing part wasn't the corpse itself. It was the eyes. The eyes were open, wide and empty, their sockets sunken and dark, but they were fixed on Jason, unblinking. He took a step back, the flashlight trembling in his hand. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead, and his mouth went dry. He wanted to turn and run, but his body wouldn't move. His legs felt like stone, and his breath came in shallow gasps, as though the very air around him had turned to molasses. And then, as if to confirm his worst fear, the eyes of the corpse flickered. Jason sucked in a sharp breath and stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from his grip and clattering to the ground. The beam cut wildly across the room, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. But it didn't matter. The eyes were still there, still staring. He scrambled to his feet, his hand trembling as he reached for the door. He had to leave. He had to get out of here. Now. But as he grabbed the doorframe, a sound came from behind him. Soft, almost like a whisper. A faint, rasping noise. Jason's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he turned around. The body was gone. The room was empty. Nothing remained but the stains on the walls and the echo of his own breath in the silence. For a long moment, he stood frozen in the darkness, unsure of what he'd just seen, or thought he had seen. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, as his mind tried to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make sense of it. The body, had it really been there? Had it disappeared in the blink of an eye? Or had it simply never existed at all? His fingers gripped the door frame, the wood splintering under the pressure, and for the first time, the urge to leave became overwhelming. His instincts were screaming at him to get out of the tunnel before it was too late. But as he stepped back into the hallway, the soft scraping sound from behind the door started again. Only this time, it was louder and closer. Jason whipped around, but the hallway was still empty. The door was ajar, dark and silent. He stared at it, the eerie scraping now louder than ever, rising in intensity with each passing second. Something was behind that door. Something was waiting for him. But it wasn't the thing behind the door that terrified him most. It was the feeling that something was waiting for him further down the tunnel, closer than ever before. Jason's heart thudded in his chest, the rhythmic pounding deafening in his ears. He stood frozen, staring at the door, the strange scraping sound coming from behind it, louder now, as though something was clawing its way out. But the tunnel ahead of him was just as silent as it had been before, empty, save for the oppressive darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. What is it? He thought. What's down there? His breath came in shallow bursts, cold and panicked. The light from his flashlight flickered again, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched like dark, hungry fingers reaching toward him. He wanted to run. God, he needed to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He could feel the weight of the tunnel pushing in on him, narrowing his options, boxing him in. The scraping noise behind the door grew louder. It wasn't a claw or a nail, not the sound of something scraping its way across stone. It was something else, something wet and sickening, like a mass of flesh, pulling and dragging itself through mud. Jason blinked, trying to shake himself out of his daze. He should have left when he had the chance. The tunnel wasn't just wrong, it was alive, and it wanted him. He could feel that now. He could feel it in every nerve, in every breath. The feeling of being followed hadn't stopped. If anything, it had intensified. He was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. He could hear it, the scratching, the movement, something stirring in the darkness, something inhuman. He turned, eyes darting down the narrow tunnel behind him. There was no sign of anything moving, but the deeper he ventured into this place, the more his senses became unhinged. The walls of the tunnel had started to shift, subtly at first, but the changes were noticeable now. An unevenness in the stone, a bulge here or there, as though the tunnel was molding itself to fit him, to follow him. Jason swallowed hard, forcing his legs to move, his body screaming for him to turn back, but he kept going, one step in front of the other, a slave to his own curiosity. The sound of the scraping intensified, sharp and insistent, until it felt like the noise was inside his skull, reverberating through his brain. He clenched his teeth, willing himself to ignore it, to focus on the tunnel, to focus on finding a way out. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Soft, hesitant footsteps, almost too faint to be real. But there they were, behind him, moving with purpose, echoing through the damp air. He spun around, his breath hitching in his throat. Nothing. Only the oppressive darkness, the tunnel stretching endlessly in both directions. The walls closed in even further. The footsteps stopped, but Jason's heart still raced. It's just in my head. It has to be in my head. But something told him it wasn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in this tunnel with him wasn't bound by the same rules of reality. It wasn't bound by time or space. It was something older, something darker, and it was getting closer. The flashlight flickered once more, and this time, Jason didn't wait for it to come back on. He spun on his heel and bolted forward, his breath ragged, his legs burning as he ran. His mind screamed at him to go faster, to get out, but the tunnel seemed endless, the shadows stretching out like a labyrinth that refused to let him escape. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the scraping stopped. Jason slowed, heart pounding in his chest. The sudden silence was just as deafening as the noise had been, and his body trembled with the aftershocks of fear. His legs wobbled beneath him as he fought to catch his breath. He couldn't stop, couldn't think clearly. His instincts had taken over, pushing him forward without mercy. He had to get out. His flashlight flickered again, then died completely, leaving him in total darkness. The air was thick and damp, and he could feel the weight of the earth above him, pressing down, suffocating him. His hand shot out, desperately seeking something, anything, to steady himself. And that's when he felt it. The walls. The walls were moving. Jason's breath hitched in his throat as he pressed his palms flat against the rough stone surface. There was no mistaking it now. The tunnel was shifting beneath his hands, contorting, stretching like it had a life of its own. He pulled his hands back as though burned, panic surging through him as he spun around, searching for some exit, some way out of this nightmare. What's happening? What is this place? That's when he noticed it. At the far end of the tunnel, beyond the place where the light had once illuminated the dark walls, something had changed. There was a faint glow now, a sickly, yellowish hue, flickering in the distance like the last breath of a dying fire. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him hesitate, enough to make him wonder if there was still a way out. His legs still felt like lead, but he forced himself to move toward the light, each step heavier than the last. The wall seemed to push in closer with every stride, and the tunnel twisted unnaturally. The feeling of being followed had never left, but now it was stronger. He was being herded, he realized. The tunnel wasn't just following him, it was guiding him. When he reached the faint light, he was met with something he hadn't expected. A door, tall and narrow, its edges jagged and warped. The wood was old, splintered, but the faint glow of light was coming from beneath it. Jason could feel the heat radiating from the threshold, warmth in the cold, oppressive darkness. The light was pulling him in, and despite every instinct telling him to run the other way, he found himself reaching for the handle. His fingers brushed the wood, and the door creaked, opening just a sliver, a sickening groan echoing through the tunnel. A gust of hot air pushed through the crack in the door, smelling of decay and rot, like something that had been buried too long. Jason pulled back, his breath catching in his throat. The sound of movement came from within, a whispering noise, like the rustling of dry leaves. But this was no breeze. This was something alive. Before he could turn around, before he could run, the footsteps were back, louder now, almost deafening. And this time, they weren't behind him. They were coming from inside the room. Jason's hand froze, inches from the door. The footsteps, closer now, came from within, scraping across the ground like nails on slate. The sound was maddening, like it was inside his skull, rattling his teeth, vibrating his bones. His heart pounded in his chest, the thrum of panic drowning out everything else, even his breath. The air felt hotter now, sticky, thick with something foul. It smelled of decay, rot, something that had no business existing here or anywhere. His mind screamed at him to run. His legs screamed at him to flee. But his hand, as if possessed, lingered on the door handle. The glow from the room beyond grew brighter, more insistent. It was like a siren's call, a magnetic pull that Jason couldn't resist. Every fiber of his being, every ounce of common sense, told him to turn back, but the grip of curiosity and terror was too powerful. He needed to know what was in there, what was behind that door. He pushed it open, just a crack, and the heat blasted out from the room like an open oven. The smell was overwhelming, sour, rotting, a blend of mildew and something worse, something that twisted the stomach into knots. He stepped forward, feeling as though the air itself was resisting him, like the tunnel was trying to drag him back, to pull him into its cold, suffocating embrace. The door creaked on rusty hinges as he nudged it wider, the scraping noise from inside growing louder still. Whatever was making that sound, whatever it was close. Too close. Then he saw it. The room was small, cramped, no more than a few yards wide. The walls were slick with dark, slick substance, no longer just mold or rust, but something alive, something writhing. The flickering light came from an ancient bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting an eerie, jaundiced glow that made the room feel alive, almost sentient. The shadows seemed to move when he wasn't looking, but it was what lay in the center of the room that made his blood run cold. At first, Jason thought it was a mannequin, a twisted, grotesque thing made from fabric and broken bones. But the closer he stepped, the more the illusion shattered. The thing wasn't still. It was breathing. It was alive. It lay on the ground, curled up in a heap, its skin a mottled shade of gray, cracked and blistered like rotting leather. Its face was obscured by long strands of matted hair, but there were cracks in the skull, hollow, deep, as though the flesh had been peeled away. In its eyes, Jason couldn't look away. They were open, vacant, staring directly at him, unblinking, hollow, dark as the void itself. He felt the floor beneath his feet give way, his legs almost buckling under him. He stumbled back, but something kept him from turning around, kept him from leaving the room. A voice, not a sound but a feeling, crawled into his mind. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the edge of hearing, but it grew louder with every second. You shouldn't have come here. Jason's breath caught in his throat, and his hands started to tremble uncontrollably. That voice wasn't his. It wasn't anything human. It felt like it was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the air itself. The tunnel wasn't just alive. It was speaking to him. It was feeding on him. The thing in the center of the room moved, slowly, painfully, its joints cracking as it shifted, dragging itself toward him. Jason wanted to run, to scream, to tear himself out of this nightmare, but his body refused to move. His legs wouldn't cooperate, and his chest felt as though a weight was pressing down on it, squeezing the air out of him. Then the thing spoke. Its voice wasn't a whisper. It was a growl, deep and guttural, like something buried under the earth for centuries, clawing its way back to life. You should have listened. Jason's body jerked, and with a cry of terror, he spun around and bolted out of the room. His foot caught on something. Maybe the rubble, maybe the shifting ground. He didn't care. But he went down hard, slamming into the floor with a bone-jarring impact. The tunnel around him seemed to close in, the walls pressing inward, suffocating him with their crushing weight. He scrambled to his feet, heart racing, breathing in ragged gasps. His hands scrambled for the walls, the floor, the ceiling, anything to give him some leverage to escape. But the tunnel wasn't letting him go. No matter how fast he moved, no matter how hard he tried, the shadows wrapped around him, pulling him back, dragging him deeper. And that's when he heard it. The sound of the thing in the room, the thing with the empty eyes crawling after him. Slow but deliberate. Each movement was like a terrible echo in his mind, a sickening reminder that there was no escape. Jason ran faster, his heart slamming against his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the tunnel didn't care. The walls were alive, twisting, shifting, narrowing with every step he took. It was as if the earth itself was conspiring against him, forcing him deeper into the heart of this nightmare. And then just as he was sure he could go no further, just as the darkness pressed in so tightly that he thought he would suffocate in it, the tunnel opened up. A vast, cavernous space unfolded before him, stretching far beyond the reach of his flashlight. But it wasn't empty. The floor was covered in things. Jason stopped in his tracks, his heart stopping in his chest. The things in the cavern weren't alive, at least not in any normal sense. They were remnants, pieces, parts of things long forgotten, scattered in haphazard piles. Clothing, bones, skin, rotting and decayed, some so old that they had turned to dust. And yet, they weren't entirely lifeless. There were shapes, forms, eyes that moved, eyes that watched him with an intelligence so cold, so predatory, that it sent a chill straight to his bones. This wasn't just a tunnel. This wasn't just an abandoned, forgotten place under the street. This was a graveyard of lost things, lost people, lost souls, and they were waiting for him. Jason couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his body paralyzed by the overwhelming realization that he wasn't just trapped in the tunnel. He was part of it now. He was one of the lost, and they were watching. Jason stood at the precipice, staring into the cavernous pit beneath him, his mind swirling in a chaos of dread and disbelief. His breath came in shallow, rapid gasps, his body trembling from the cold, unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. The stench of decay, of things long forgotten, hung thick in the air, nearly choking him. The piles of bones and tattered clothing surrounded him. But it wasn't just the physical presence of the remnants that terrified him. No, it was something much worse. The eyes. They were everywhere. They glowed faintly in the dark, some barely visible, others watching him with an intensity that felt personal. Jason could swear that he could feel their weight, the judgment, the accusation pressing against his chest. They weren't just remnants of the past. These were things that had once been. Someone had once been here, and now it seemed they were waiting for him. His legs felt heavy, his feet unwilling to move. The world around him seemed to tilt, as though the ground itself was going to swallow him whole. The tunnel, which had once been a narrow, claustrophobic space, now felt like a vast chasm, an endless void into which he had stumbled, unable to find a way out. He was trapped. He knew it. The walls had shifted so much that the path he had taken to reach this place no longer existed. There was no way back. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of the place. This wasn't just a tunnel. It was a door to something much darker, something that had been waiting for him, waiting for all of them. Jason tried to take a step backward, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs refused to lift, and the ground beneath him felt as though it was sinking, soft and pliable like wet clay. The eyes blinked, one after another, and then they moved, slowly, deliberately, like something stirring from a long, dreamless sleep. They began to blink in rhythm, as if responding to him, as if they knew him. And then, one by one, the eyes started to whisper. The sound was so quiet at first, so faint, like the rustling of dry leaves, but it grew louder with every passing second. The whispers carried with them an unmistakable sense of hunger, the kind of hunger that could tear a person apart, mind and body alike, without mercy. Jason couldn't make out the words, at least not at first. It was a cacophony, a chorus of voices layered on top of one another, each one faintly distinct, yet incomprehensible. But then, as if they had all synchronized, A single voice rose above the rest, clear and unyielding. "You shouldn't have come." Jason staggered back, his heart racing, a cold sweat soaking his clothes. His throat tightened, the words choking him as they wrapped around his chest. He didn't need to hear the rest to understand. He had made a terrible mistake. The tunnel was alive. It wasn't just a path through the earth. It was a prison, a place where lost souls went to rot and fester. And those souls had been waiting for someone like him to stumble upon it, someone to feed on, someone to add to the collection. The walls seemed to pulse now, and the ground beneath him shuddered as if something large and heavy was moving, pressing itself against the earth, waking up after years of slumber. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic, and Jason's knees gave out. He dropped to the floor, his hands scraping against the wet, sticky ground as if it were alive, trying to pull him down with it. A soft, wet sound, like something dragging itself through mud, echoed from the farthest corners of the cavern. Jason's head snapped up, his pulse racing, his eyes frantically scanning the shadows. And there, in the dim light, he saw it. A figure, hunched and twisted, its form barely visible through the piles of bones and rotting fabric. It was moving toward him. He could feel its eyes on him, even though he couldn't see its face. He could feel the weight of its gaze, the hatred and hunger that emanated from it like a physical force. The figure dragged itself forward, its hands clawing at the earth, each movement a sickening scraping sound. Jason couldn't breathe. His vision blurred as the creature drew closer, its face still obscured by shadow. But there was something about its silhouette that felt familiar, something that made Jason's skin crawl. He didn't have to see its face to know. It was one of them, one of the lost. A whisper floated to his ears, a voice so soft and close that it felt like a breath against his skin. "You're too late." Jason's chest tightened, panic surging through him. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble with every step the thing took, and the whispering voices grew louder, faster, as though they were closing in around him. He couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go. The walls, the floor, the very air was suffocating him. The figure reached out, its hands long and skeletal, its fingers like claws. They brushed against Jason's arm, cold as ice, and the shock of the touch sent a jolt of terror through him, paralyzing him. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. His body was no longer his own. The thing pulled itself closer, its face still hidden in the darkness, but Jason could feel its eyes. Those empty, endless eyes, searching his soul. And then, just as it was about to reach him, the whispering stopped. The voices, all at once, fell silent. Jason's heart thundered in his chest, his eyes locked on the thing in front of him. There was no escape now, no way out. And that's when the ground beneath him gave way. The walls, the ceiling, everything seemed to shift, and in a blink, Jason was falling. It wasn't a long fall, but it felt like an eternity, the tunnel stretching out beneath him like a yawning abyss. And when he hit the ground, he didn't land on solid earth. He landed on bones. Jason gasped, his body trembling uncontrollably as he tried to rise, but the floor shifted beneath him, as if the bones themselves were alive. The whispers started again, soft at first, then louder, rising in a crescendo. 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, all demanding the same thing: welcome home. And in that moment, Jason understood. The tunnel wasn't just a passage. It was a trap, a door to something darker, something older, something that had been waiting for him, for anyone foolish enough to cross its threshold. And now, there was no going back. The first time Emma noticed something was missing. It was small, so small, in fact, that she almost convinced herself it was nothing. A detail, easily forgotten. She'd been at the grocery store, strolling through the aisles, when she found herself staring blankly at a shelf filled with bags of chips. It was odd. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten chips. But more unsettling than that was the fact that she couldn't remember which kind she liked best. Was it barbecue? Sour cream and onion? The ones with ridges? Nothing about her preference felt solid anymore. She brushed it off as a momentary lapse in thought, something trivial, and went about her day. But the next time it happened, it wasn't chips. It was her best friend's name. Emma had been at the cafe, chatting with a woman she had known for years. The conversation flowed easily, as it always had, until they began reminiscing about their past. The woman, her friend, her old friend, Emma corrected herself, spoke of the time they went to a concert together. But Emma couldn't recall which concert. She stared at her friend for a long moment, trying to summon the memory, but it slipped through her fingers like smoke. The more she thought, the more it slipped away, and she had to force a smile, nodding along as her friend spoke. "What's wrong?" her friend asked. "You seem off today." Emma's lips quivered with the beginnings of a lie. She wasn't feeling great, just a little under the weather, but then she stopped, unsure. She didn't know what she was feeling, not really. Maybe her stomach was churning because the thought of the concert, the one she couldn't place, bothered her more than it should have. Or maybe it was something else, something bigger, something deeper. The thought settled like a stone in her stomach. Later that night, she sat in her apartment, staring at the dim light of her computer screen. The apartment felt foreign. The furniture, the walls, the carpet under her feet, all of it felt like someone else's life, like she'd walked into a stranger's home and taken up residence without knowing it. And then it happened again. Her mother's face had flickered in her mind, a soft, familiar presence that had once been comforting, warm. But as Emma tried to call up the memory of her mother's voice, her laugh, the way she used to hum while doing dishes, it was gone. Not just vague, not blurry, but completely, utterly gone. It was like there was a hole where the memory had been, a space in her mind, a void that she couldn't fill. She opened her mouth, ready to call her mother, but before the phone could even reach her ear, the thought vanished. What was happening to her? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something more than just an aging mind or the stress of life creeping in. This was different. It was as though someone had come into her life, unnoticed, and started pulling at the threads that held her together. Like a thief, quietly in the dead of night, taking her memories without a sound. But who or what could steal memories? How did someone even begin to explain that? The next day, Emma went to work, but it was harder to focus than it had ever been before. Her desk, the clutter of files and notes and half-finished projects, all felt irrelevant, like they belonged to someone else. The people she worked with were polite but distant. They didn't seem to notice the slight fog creeping into her thoughts, the occasional blank spots in her memory that became more frequent with each passing hour. Her boss, a middle-aged man named Daniel, called her into his office around lunchtime. He didn't seem concerned, but he was noticing the change. She could tell by the way he was watching her closely. "Emma," he said, sitting behind his desk, "I know you're under a lot of pressure with this project, but you've been missing meetings and your reports are off. Are you all right?" She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to explain, to tell him that it wasn't stress, that it wasn't exhaustion, but that she felt different, uncertain. But how could she explain something she didn't even understand herself? "I'm fine," she said at last, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired. I'll get on top of it." Daniel didn't seem convinced, but he nodded and went back to his work. Emma left his office, but the unease lingered in her chest, heavier now. That night, when she returned to her apartment, she stood before the bathroom mirror, searching her reflection for something familiar. She reached up to touch her hair, the strands soft beneath her fingers, but even that felt wrong. How long had it been since she'd had it cut? Was it longer than it used to be? Or was it shorter? As she stared at herself, the reflection, her own face, the one she had seen every day of her life, seemed to blur at the edges. For a moment, she thought she saw something shift in the mirror, something dark and fleeting, just beyond her peripheral vision. She blinked and it was gone. Her heart skipped a beat. It was in that moment, standing there, alone in the dim light, that the thought settled deep within her mind. The memories weren't just fading, they were being taken. It was as if someone or something was reaching into her mind, pulling out the things that made her who she was, and leaving her hollow. And no matter how hard she tried to remember, the details slipped further and further away, until they were completely gone. She gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles turning white. The sensation of someone else inside her head, rifling through her thoughts, stealing the very things that had defined her. It made her want to scream. But who could she tell? There was no name for what was happening to her. No medical condition that could explain the loss, the theft of her very identity. It wasn't until the next day, after her strange conversation with her friend, whose name now seemed unfamiliar to her, that Emma noticed something even more disturbing. As she sat at her desk, the weight of the growing panic gnawing at her gut, she tried to focus on her work, but instead of focusing on the task in front of her, her eyes wandered, falling on the framed photograph of herself and her mother. It had been taken years ago on a trip to the coast, one of those rare days when everything had felt perfect. The sun had been high in the sky, the waves crashing in the distance. Emma had been smiling, the kind of smile that came from the heart, the kind that didn't fade. But now, as she stared at the photo, she realized that she couldn't remember anything about that day. Not the trip, not the laughter, not the warmth of her mother's hand in hers. Nothing. It was as if the memory had never existed at all. The photo was still there, still framed, still hanging on the wall. But the memory that should have been attached to it was missing. The thief had struck again. The following morning, Jennifer sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty mug in front of her. The dull hum of the coffee maker echoed in the background, its gentle gurgle barely enough to mask the silence that had settled over the room. She wasn't tired, not really, but she wasn't awake either, not fully. The fog had settled deeper now. She could feel it pressing in, making everything a little duller, a little less vibrant. It wasn't like a hangover, not that gnawing, painful sensation that followed a night of drinking. No, this felt more insidious, like a shadow creeping over her mind, blotting out pieces of her world. It wasn't just the gaps in her memories anymore. It was the sense that something was missing, and no matter how hard she tried to remember, she couldn't quite reach it. What was worse, she didn't know if she could trust herself to remember. Jennifer's hands trembled as she brought the mug to her lips, the bitter taste of lukewarm coffee doing nothing to ground her. She set the mug back down, hands shaking. A pulse of nausea gripped her, and for a moment she thought she might be sick. Her gaze flickered to the window, to the street outside, where the sun barely shone through the thin clouds. But it wasn't the gray skies that caught her attention. It was the reflection. The glass, a pale frosted rectangle, was like a mirror. And in that mirror, no, it wasn't her reflection. Not fully. Her features were distorted, but not in a way that was immediately alarming. The hair, shorter than she remembered. The eyes, darker than the soft brown she thought they were. And then, the smile. It wasn't hers. Jennifer's breath hitched. The smile, thin, almost sinister, twisted the image in the reflection until it felt wrong. That wasn't her face. It wasn't her at all. She blinked, and the reflection steadied itself. The normal features she knew appeared again. But the moment was gone. The hollow ache in her chest settled back into place, even deeper than before. Maybe it was just fatigue. Maybe she was imagining things. But then again, how much of what she remembered was real anymore? The cracks in her reality were becoming too large to ignore. Jennifer forced herself to move, standing up from the table, her legs weak beneath her. She grabbed her coat from the hook near the door and stepped out into the cold morning air, trying to shake off the sensation that everything was slipping out of her grasp. The apartment she had lived in for years, the one she decorated with care, the one that held her memories, felt like an alien place now. In the world outside, it wasn't much better. Her neighborhood, once familiar, had begun to change in ways she couldn't explain. The streets, the buildings, none of it felt right anymore. There was a wrongness to the architecture, the way the houses leaned slightly, as though gravity had forgotten how to pull them downward. The sidewalks were cracked in patterns that felt too deliberate, too unnatural, as though someone had taken a mallet and hammered at the earth until it buckled. Jennifer's steps echoed unnervingly loud against the empty streets. She passed the old coffee shop where she used to meet friends, but it was closed, not boarded up, just closed. The lights were off. The chairs sat empty, some toppled as though they hadn't been used in years. She stood in front of it for a long moment, confused. Had it always been like this? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. The display read, "Unknown number." Jennifer hesitated, then swiped the screen. "Hello?" she said, her voice sounding far more distant than she expected. There was a long pause before a voice came on the line. It wasn't familiar, at least, not at first. The tone was low, gravelly, almost faint. "I see you've noticed. I was wondering how long it would take." Her heart slammed against her ribcage, cold dread flooding her veins. "Who is this?" she demanded, gripping the phone tighter. The voice on the other end chuckled, the sound unsettling, like something scraping its nails across a blackboard. "It's not important who I am. What matters is what I'm taking from you." The words slithered into her mind, taking root. She felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you want?" Jennifer asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Your memories. They've been slipping away for some time now, haven't they?" Jennifer's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered, panic rising in her chest. Her fingers clutched at the phone, the grip becoming tight, as if she could somehow hold on to reality by sheer force. "A thief, a collector. It's not personal." Jennifer's stomach churned, and she staggered backward as though the ground itself was shifting beneath her. A strange, icy weight pressed against her chest. A creeping, suffocating feeling of being watched began to crawl over her skin. She spun in a circle, desperately searching for something, anything, that would make sense of this madness. "Where are you?" she demanded, her voice rising. The line went dead. The street seemed too quiet now, too still. Even the wind had stopped blowing, leaving only the cold, thick air behind. The hairs on the back of Jennifer's neck stood on end as the feeling of eyes, unseen, unrelenting, grew stronger. The sensation was so overpowering that her knees buckled beneath her, sending her down to the cracked pavement. She could feel it, the presence that lingered just out of sight. She didn't need to see it. She didn't need to hear it. She could feel it in her bones, in her very soul. And then, with a jolt, a new memory surged in her mind. An old memory, one she hadn't thought about in years. She was sitting at a picnic table with her brother, laughing over an ice cream cone on a summer day. His face was clear in her mind, his grin wide, his laugh the kind of sound that filled her chest with warmth. It was a real memory, a true memory. And yet, as soon as it had appeared, it began to fray at the edges. The details blurred, the laughter faded, and then, nothing. It was gone. She wasn't sure how long she sat there on the sidewalk, staring at the empty street. But when she finally stood up, her legs felt weak and unsteady. Her body drained as though something inside her had been siphoned away. She had no choice but to keep moving. Jennifer made her way back to her apartment, but she knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to help. The thief was still out there, watching, waiting, and it was only a matter of time before there would be nothing left. The following days bled together like watercolor on wet paper, faint, runny, indistinct. The memories Jennifer was losing came in waves, sometimes in torrents, other times in trickles. A song she used to hum while doing laundry, gone. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street, faint, like it was a memory of a memory. And then, the worst one, her father's face, blurred and fading, until there was nothing left but the hollow ache of a name she could barely recall. And that voice, the voice that had called her, whispered into her ear from the other end of the phone, lingered in her mind like the smoke of something burning that wouldn't quite dissipate. It wasn't just a voice, though. It was the promise it made, the understanding that her memories weren't disappearing by accident. They were being taken. Her reflection was starting to trouble her more than it had before. No matter how many times she looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize herself completely anymore. It was as though she were a stranger, someone who looked like Jennifer, but wasn't entirely. Sometimes her hair seemed longer than it should be. Other times it was too short. Sometimes her eyes were the brown she remembered, but other times they looked too wide, too dark. The woman who stared back at her was a collection of parts that didn't quite fit together. Pieces of a puzzle with the edges filed down and the colors starting to blur. Jennifer tried to shake it off, tried to tell herself that this was just stress, that she was simply exhausted, too far into her own head to think straight. But the unease gnawed at her like a slow poison. She was losing control piece by piece. She could feel it in her bones, in the air, like something dark was closing in on her, waiting for the moment she would forget enough to be swallowed whole. On Thursday afternoon, she went to the library, hoping that the quiet would help her think. It wasn't like she had a plan. Not really. She wasn't looking for answers. What answers could she even find? She had no idea what was happening to her, but the library, with its rows upon rows of books, felt like a sanctuary. Somewhere in those dusty, yellowed pages, she hoped there might be a fragment of truth, something she could cling to before the last shred of her identity slipped away. The old man behind the desk, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a faded cardigan, gave her a long look when she walked through the door. He was always there, reading in the corner, watching the entrance with sharp, unblinking eyes. Jennifer had never spoken to him. She wasn't sure she had ever seen him, really, until today. But now that he was there, standing behind the counter, she could feel him watching her, studying her with a quiet, unnerving intensity. She tried to ignore him, walking past the rows of bookshelves with a quick, determined step. The air inside the library was musty, thick with the scent of old paper and ink. Jennifer's shoes squeaked against the tile floor, and the sound echoed through the silence, unnervingly loud. When she reached the back of the library, where the shelves were nearly empty, she turned into an aisle and picked out a random book, a thick, leather-bound volume that looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. She opened it, pretending to read, but her mind wandered. It was the same feeling that had been following her since she first noticed the missing memories, like someone had walked in and rearranged everything in her life, and now she was left trying to find a way to make sense of the chaos. It was then that she heard it, a faint sound coming from behind her, a whisper. At first, she thought it was the old man behind the desk, but it didn't sound like him. The voice was too close, too familiar, and then it stopped. Jennifer's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded. She turned, but there was no one there. No one in the aisle. No one behind the shelves. The library was as empty as it had been when she entered. But something had shifted. The whisper. It had come from inside her own head, as though it had been planted there. Not a thought, but a command. A push. Find me. Jennifer's pulse quickened. She could feel the walls of the library pressing in around her, closing tighter and tighter. It wasn't the library anymore. It wasn't the comforting refuge she had sought. It was a trap. She was being led somewhere. To what? She shoved the book back onto the shelf and turned to leave. But as she moved toward the door, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow crossing the far wall. But then the shadow moved. It darted in front of her, cutting her off, just for a moment, long enough to make her pause. A shape, a blur, just out of focus, but too distinct to be ignored. She blinked, and it was gone. Her mind raced. That thing, what was it? It wasn't real. It couldn't have been. She turned around, her footsteps quickening, but she didn't dare look behind her. She couldn't. When she reached the front doors, she was almost running. She swung them open, spilling out into the daylight, gasping for air like she'd been underwater. The fresh air hit her lungs like a punch, but it didn't ease the suffocating sensation in her chest. She had to know what was happening. She had to find out where the memories were going, who was taking them. She had to stop the thief. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, and Jennifer nearly dropped it, the sudden sound sending a jolt of panic through her. She didn't want to answer, but she knew she had to. With shaking hands, she answered it. "This is Jennifer," she said, her voice strained. There was no response, only static. And then, faintly, the same voice, the same low, gravelly whisper that had been in her head before. "You're getting closer, but it's too late. There's nothing left for you to find." Jennifer's throat went dry. "Who are you?" she demanded, barely recognizing the tremble in her voice. But the voice on the other end simply laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. The memory thief doesn't need a name. It never does. You should have stayed where you were, Jennifer. The longer you fight, the more you lose. The line went dead. Jennifer stood on the sidewalk, her breath shallow, feeling the ground tilt beneath her feet. The world seemed to spin, the edges of everything beginning to blur. The reality she had known was crumbling, and in its place was something darker, something older. The thief was real, and it was closer than she could have ever imagined. The phone call left Jennifer feeling hollow, like someone had drained her very essence from her body. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time after the line went dead, the sound of traffic swirling around her, but distant, as if muffled by the strange, thick fog that seemed to be descending on her mind. She felt like a ghost in her own life, a shadow walking through a world that no longer felt real. She had no answers, no idea how to fight this thing that was taking everything from her. The memories, the pieces of herself, were slipping away, each one more precious than the last. She felt like she was losing control of her own story, watching it unravel bit by bit, and she had no way of stopping it. Jennifer's fingers shook as she clutched the phone to her ear, the sound of static still lingering in her head like an echo. She needed to get away, to clear her mind, but she couldn't escape what was happening. The thief was real, and it was hunting her. She walked aimlessly, her feet carrying her without direction. The streets she passed were the same ones she had known her whole life, but they felt unfamiliar now, distorted. The world around her felt like a house of mirrors, everything reflecting back at her in twisted, fragmented pieces. She could feel the emptiness inside of her, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. The city was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that made her skin prickle, that made her heart race, her breath catch in her throat. Something was wrong. She could feel it just beneath the surface of her thoughts, like a dark undercurrent pulling at her, urging her to turn around, to run. But where would she go? Her feet took her to the edge of the city, near the old industrial district, where the buildings loomed like forgotten monuments. She had never been here before, or at least she didn't remember ever coming here. The streets were empty, the windows dark, and the air hung heavy with the smell of rust and decay. It was here, in the shadow of the crumbling buildings, that she saw it, the alleyway. It was narrow, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, and it disappeared into darkness, as though it led to nowhere. Something about it called to her, like a whisper in the back of her mind, urging her forward. It was as if the alley had been waiting for her, beckoning her into its depths. Her feet moved of their own accord. She didn't want to go down there, but she couldn't stop herself. She knew, deep down, that this was where the thief would lead her. This was where it had always been leading her. As she stepped into the alley, a chill ran down her spine. The walls seemed to close in around her, the narrow space making it feel like she was walking through a tunnel. The air grew colder. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, her breath coming out in visible puffs. There was a faint sound ahead, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't alone. She turned to look behind her, but the alleyway had disappeared. The entrance, the street, everything. Gone. It was just the tunnel now, stretching out before her into an abyss of darkness. She felt the pressure on her chest increase, as if the air itself was thickening, becoming harder to breathe. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. She could feel the presence drawing near, like something or someone was following her, watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she couldn't suppress the rising panic in her chest. She tried to turn and run, but her legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the tunnel was pulling her forward, dragging her deeper into the darkness. Her feet moved on their own, faster now, as though some invisible force was forcing her to move, to get closer to the thing at the end of the alley. And then the whisper came again. You can't escape. It was so close now, she could feel it in her ears, in her bones, crawling beneath her skin. The alley curved, and as Jennifer rounded the corner, the darkness deepened. But then there was a light, faint, far away, barely more than a glow in the distance. It was the only thing that seemed real, the only thing that seemed to make sense. She reached the light, her legs shaky, her breath ragged. The tunnel opened into a small, dimly lit room, a room that shouldn't have existed in the middle of the city. The walls were bare, cold concrete, and in the center of the room stood a wooden chair. But it wasn't the chair that caught Jennifer's attention. It was the figure sitting in it. It was her. Jennifer blinked, and the figure in the chair didn't change. It was a perfect replica of her, but somehow wrong. The face was pale, drawn, and the eyes, those dark eyes, were hollow, as though there was nothing left behind them. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected back a version of herself that was empty. She took a step forward, her heart racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the more she stared at the figure, the more it felt like it was. Too real. Then the figure in the chair spoke, its voice a rasping, hollow echo of her own. You've come to take me back, haven't you? Jennifer froze. She couldn't speak. She didn't know what to say. She didn't understand what was happening. The figure smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was twisted, jagged, like the cracks in a shattered mirror. You're the one who's been stealing my memories. You're the one who's been taking everything from me. The words hit Jennifer like a punch to the gut. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. The figure stood up, slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. It reached out, and Jennifer could feel the chill of its touch, even from where she stood. It was the cold of a long-forgotten grave, the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones and made you feel like you would never be warm again. I was the one who forgot first, the figure whispered, its breath icy. And now, you're the one. who's going to forget everything. Jennifer's stomach churned. She backed away, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let it take her too. But the figure's eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, held her in place, locked her there as if she were trapped in the very depths of her own soul. It was happening. She could feel it. She was slipping. The thief was here, and this time there would be no escape. The room seemed to close in around her. Jennifer's breath came in ragged gasps, her hands shaking as they gripped the edges of the doorway. She couldn't look away from the figure that stood before her, the twisted, hollow version of herself. Every movement it made felt wrong, as though it wasn't supposed to be there, but it was. It was too real, too painfully familiar. The figure's smile spread wider, like it was savoring the fear on Jennifer's face. "You've come to take me back, haven't you?" It repeated, its voice echoing in the stillness, warping and bending like something you couldn't quite trust. Jennifer staggered back, her heart racing, her mind crashing through the fog of confusion. The figure, was it really her? No, it couldn't be. It had to be some kind of trick, a cruel, twisted reflection. But as she stared into those hollow eyes, she felt something inside her stir, the same kind of darkness that had been creeping up on her for days, the feeling that something essential was slipping through her fingers. Was this it? Was this who she was becoming? "You're the one who's been stealing my memories. You're the one who's been taking everything from me." Jennifer's legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to her knees, her head spinning. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on her with an oppressive weight. Her thoughts jumbled together, impossible to separate. She was losing control, losing herself, and it felt like she was being pulled apart, piece by piece. The figure took a slow step toward her. "I was the one who forgot first," it whispered, its voice cold and thin, like the wind howling through a desolate place. "And now, you're the one who's going to forget everything." Jennifer's hands flew to her head, clutching her scalp like it was the only thing holding her together. The emptiness inside her deepened, expanding, swallowing everything. She could hear the whispers, faint but constant, crawling through her thoughts like insects. "Find me. It's too late. You don't remember." Her eyes burned, her vision blurring. Every memory that had once felt solid, her childhood, her first kiss, the small quiet moments that had once filled her with warmth, now seemed distant, fogged over, fading in and out like an old photograph left out in the sun too long. Each memory crumbled at the edges, becoming more distant, less real. The figure took another step. Jennifer could feel it now, like a cold weight settling deep inside her, pressing on her chest. She didn't know where to turn, how to escape. The thief was here. It was inside her mind, inside her very soul, devouring her from the inside out. "You're becoming me," the figure murmured, the smile on its face growing even wider. "Everything you are, everything you've been, is mine now. I will take everything you've ever known, and you will become nothing, just like I did." Jennifer opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice, like everything else, was slipping away, vanishing, absorbed into the darkness. She was losing it all, piece by piece. She didn't know how long she had left. Maybe she had no time at all. A voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. "Jennifer!" She blinked, disoriented, and the world seemed to shudder around her. The figure in front of her faltered, its form blurring for a moment. The room seemed to warp, as if reality itself were being torn open. "Jennifer, look at me!" The voice, it was familiar. Jennifer's pulse surged, a faint glimmer of hope flickering through the haze. She knew that voice. It wasn't the hollow whisper of the figure. It was someone else. Someone who hadn't disappeared. Her hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from her forehead. The darkness around her seemed to pull back for a moment, giving her a glimpse of clarity. In front of her, standing just beyond the twisted figure, was someone she hadn't expected to see. It was her, but it wasn't the distorted, hollow version of herself standing before her. This version of Jennifer was whole, complete, alive. It was her, before the thief had come, before everything had started to fall apart. "You're still here," the familiar voice said, softer now, more reassuring. "You can fight it. You have to remember who you are." The figure in the chair snarled, its face contorting in a grotesque mask of rage. It lunged forward, but the moment it touched Jennifer's skin, it dissolved, as though it had never been there at all. The air around her felt charged, crackling, and Jennifer's head throbbed with an intensity that was almost unbearable. And then everything stopped. For a moment, the world was utterly still. Jennifer gasped, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. Her thoughts were clearer now, at least clearer than they had been in days. She could feel her feet on the ground beneath her, the weight of her body, the weight of her existence, grounding her in this moment, in this reality. But even as she breathed in the air of the present, she knew something terrible lingered beneath the surface, just out of sight, waiting to rise again. "Jennifer," the voice called once more. This time, Jennifer didn't hesitate. She didn't have the luxury of hesitation anymore. She knew what she had to do. She remembered. She remembered everything. The moments, the people, the emotions that had once felt so vivid, so real. The pieces of herself that had been stolen. But more importantly, she understood now that the thief wasn't just taking memories. It was taking identity. It fed on the pieces that made her who she was. And the more it took, the closer it came to becoming her. Jennifer wasn't just fighting to get her memories back. She was fighting to keep her soul intact. And for the first time since all of this began, Jennifer understood something else. The memory thief had been watching her for much longer than she realized. It had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to forget, waiting for her to slip. But now, she had something the thief didn't. She had herself. And no matter how far it came, no matter how deep it tried to bury her, she wasn't going to let it win. Jennifer closed her eyes, the world fading to a deep, oppressive silence. She braced herself, ready to face whatever came next. She would fight, because in the end, there was only one thing that truly mattered. Her memories, her life, her fight. And this time, she wasn't going to lose. The car rumbled down the narrow, cracked road, tires grinding against gravel as it snaked through the forest. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. Inside the vehicle, the air felt thick with anticipation, a strange hum that seemed to pulse beneath the surface of conversation. A weekend getaway, a retreat from the grind of city life. But something about this place felt wrong, even before they arrived. "You sure this is the right turn?" Riley asked, glancing over at her phone. The GPS screen blinked an error message. The signal lost once they turned off the main road an hour ago. Max, who had been driving, let out a laugh, but it was tinged with something that sounded like nerves. "We're almost there. Just follow the signs. This place is off the map, literally." They had all heard the stories, of course, whispers from friends of friends who had gone up into the woods, only to return with eyes wide and voices shaking. Strange things that didn't make sense, happening to people who ventured too far into the forest. Some talked about hearing voices on the wind, others of time slipping through their fingers like sand. But that was just the kind of stuff people said when they wanted to spice up a camping trip, right? Toby, sitting in the back seat, nudged Riley and grinned. "It's just an old forest, right? Nothing weird about it. They probably just want you to think there's something up here to keep people out." Riley nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling in her gut. It wasn't a fear of the unknown. It was a feeling of being watched, of being seen, even though there was no one around for miles. Max was still laughing, as if trying to convince himself too. "Look, we'll set up camp, drink some beers, tell a few ghost stories, and that'll be it. By Sunday, we'll all be back home, like nothing happened." It was a comforting thought, but even as he said it, something about it didn't ring true. Riley's eyes flicked to the forest, the shadows growing darker and deeper as they drove. The trees were tall, like sentinels standing in watch. The trunks were thick, their bark gnarled and worn by centuries of wind and rain, their leaves shifting in the evening breeze. Yet, beneath it all, something felt off. Riley let her gaze drift to the trees as they passed by, wondering what it would be like to step off the road, to go deep into the forest. There was a stillness to it, a quiet that felt unnatural, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she leaned back into her seat, tapping her fingers on the armrest in a rhythm she couldn't control. Minutes passed, and soon they rounded a bend and came into a clearing. Max slowed the car, his headlights briefly cutting through the trees like a knife, illuminating the rough-hewn trail that led deeper into the woods. "Well, here we are," Max muttered, turning off the engine. "This is it. Welcome to the cursed forest." The words came out as a joke, but no one laughed. Riley's eyes narrowed as she looked around. There were no cabins, no signs of other campers, just thick trees and the faint hum of insects in the air. The forest seemed to breathe, as though it were alive. She could almost hear it, that faint pulse, like the heart of the world itself, was beating underneath them. Toby unbuckled his seatbelt first, swinging the door open and stepping out. "I'll help with the gear," he said, already reaching for the back of the car. Max and Riley followed suit, and the three of them began pulling the tents, sleeping bags, and other camping gear from the trunk. They were barely 20 feet from the car when the wind shifted, carrying with it a peculiar scent, a heavy, earthy aroma that didn't belong in a forest at this time of year. Max sniffed the air. "What the hell is that? Something rotting?" Riley suggested, wrinkling her nose. The smell was familiar, but it didn't sit right. Toby shrugged, his hands full of a cooler. "Must be some dead animal or something. Let's not freak out about it." But the smell lingered, clinging to the back of Riley's throat like something poisonous. She wanted to ask if they could just leave, head back to the city, make up an excuse. But something deep in her chest told her that it was already too late for that. They were here now, and whatever was waiting for them in these woods had already begun to take hold of their reality. Nightfall came quickly. They set up the campfire in the center of the clearing, the orange and red of the flames flickering in the growing darkness. The forest seemed to push in around them, like it was leaning in to listen as they sat on the cold ground, cracking open beers and talking about the past. Max was telling an old story about a road trip gone wrong when Riley noticed something. It was subtle at first, but as the night stretched on, it became more pronounced. Every clock, every one of them, had stopped. Toby's wristwatch, Max's phone, Riley's old alarm clock she'd brought along for the trip. She glanced at her phone, and the time read 8:42 p.m. But when she checked again, minutes later, it still read 8:42. No matter how many times she looked, the time didn't change. "Did your phones die?" she asked, her voice tight. Max frowned, checking his phone and then holding it out to show her. "No, it's just stuck on this. Weird, huh? Maybe it's just the signal. You know how it gets out here," Toby suggested, but there was a trace of uncertainty in his voice. Riley stood up and walked over to the nearest tree, looking out into the forest. The air was thick, heavy, but the strangest thing was that the forest was completely still. No wind, no rustling of leaves. It felt like everything had stopped moving, as though time itself was holding its breath. When she turned back to the campfire, she saw it, the shadows. They were deeper than before, stretching unnaturally across the clearing, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. The darkness was thick, oppressive. It felt like something was waiting, something ancient and hungry, its patience infinite. Riley's stomach turned, and she took a few steps backward toward the fire. "This isn't right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Max looked up, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the forest. It's like everything stopped." Toby laughed, though it was a nervous sound. "You're just spooked, that's all. It's an old forest. Old forests do weird things to you." But even as he said it, Riley could see the way his eyes darted toward the trees, his shoulders tensed. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Then, just as Riley was about to say something else, she heard it, a sound soft and far off, but unmistakable, a low, murmuring hum. She turned sharply, searching the shadows, but the sound was gone. Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to focus. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Max and Toby exchanged uncertain glances. "Hear what?" Max asked, his voice tight. "I swear I heard something, like someone whispering," she said. "Okay, now you're freaking me out," Toby said with a nervous laugh. He stood up, walking toward the edge of the clearing. "I'm just going to check out the woods, make sure we're not getting jumped by a bear or something." But before he could step away, there was a strange, soft sound, like a distant rustle, but it came from the opposite direction of where Toby had just walked, a rustling that came from deep within the trees, far beyond the clearing. Riley's heart began to race. "Toby?" No response. The fire crackled in the silence, but there was something else now, something wrong. And as Riley glanced at the clocks again, her stomach dropped. 8:42. Still. The wind kicked up suddenly, a sharp, biting gust that cut through the trees like a knife. Riley shuddered, but it wasn't just the chill of the breeze. It was something deeper, something unnatural in the air. The rustling sound she had heard before came again, but this time it was closer. The movement of the trees was no longer just the wind. It felt purposeful, like a presence shifting in the shadows, something large and waiting. "Toby?" Riley called again, her voice strained. and unsteady. Her breath came quicker now, as if the very act of calling out was forcing the air from her lungs. "Where the hell are you?" Max stood up, rubbing his palms together as if trying to ward off an unshakable cold. His eyes darted nervously toward the tree line, the firelight flickering uneasily. "He's probably just messing around. You know how he is." But there was an edge of concern in his voice, one that he didn't bother to hide. Riley wasn't convinced. She had known Toby long enough to tell the difference between his usual reckless bravado and something more real. She took a few quick steps toward the edge of the clearing, her boots crunching against the brittle underbrush. "Toby," she called out again, a little louder this time, though it sounded more like an echo bouncing back from the blackness around them. Max grabbed her arm, his grip tighter than necessary. "Don't go into the woods alone. It's dark as hell out there. You can't see a thing." "I'm not staying here with the fire," Riley snapped, yanking her arm free. "We need to find him. It's not funny anymore." There was no response from Toby, no sounds of footsteps, no shuffling through leaves, just the ever-deepening silence that began to close in around them. Riley felt her chest tighten as she stepped toward the trees, the dark foliage swallowing the last traces of daylight. She didn't care if she was overreacting. Something wasn't right. Her feet moved faster now, her breath shallow, the tension in the air pressing against her skin like a heavy, invisible weight. She had almost reached the tree line when she heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something else. She froze in her tracks, her heart hammered in her chest, a rhythm that didn't feel her own. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, straining to see something, anything, moving within the dark expanse of the forest. The growl came again, louder this time, but it was distorted, as if the very air itself was warping the sound. "It's coming from the trees." A shiver ran down Riley's spine as she turned back to the fire. Max was still sitting there, his eyes wide, a fearful tension creeping across his features. She couldn't see his face clearly in the dim light, but she knew what he was thinking. He felt it too, but there was no time to comfort him, to pretend everything was okay. Number something was out there, and Toby had ventured too deep into it. He was lost now, and Riley was certain of it, lost in more ways than one. "Max," she called, her voice sharper now, filled with a sense of urgency. "We need to go after him. Now." Max stood, the motion slow and deliberate, as if the act of standing itself took too much effort. He looked around nervously, but his eyes kept flicking back toward the blackened trees. His hands were trembling, and Riley noticed how pale his face had become. But there was something else too, a subtle shift in his demeanor, like he was trying to push past something he didn't want to admit. "Maybe we should wait for him to come back," Max suggested, his voice tight, unconvincing. "No," Riley snapped. She couldn't stay here any longer. "We're not waiting. I'm not waiting for him to not come back." Riley didn't wait for Max to say another word. She turned and pushed into the darkness of the trees, not bothering to look back. The air in the woods was thick and heavy, an oppressive silence weighing down on her chest. Every step felt like it took longer than the last. The trees closed in around her, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, scraping at the night sky. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the eerie stillness that made every movement feel wrong. Riley's heart beat in her throat, a jagged rhythm that only seemed to grow louder with each passing second. "Come on, Toby. Where the hell are you?" She was deep in the woods now, far enough that the firelight from the camp had all but vanished, swallowed by the dark expanse. Her flashlight trembled in her grip, its beam flickering and sputtering as she pushed forward, her eyes darting around every corner of the trees. The shadows seemed to shift, to lengthen, twisting like creatures waiting to pounce. But when she turned her head to check, the woods were as still as they had been. She took another step, and this time she felt it. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, the earth soft in places where it shouldn't be. She reached down to steady herself, but her hand brushed against something cold, something wet. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled her hand away and brought it to her eyes. Dark, sticky blood. Her stomach churned, but she didn't dare hesitate. She couldn't stop now. Not with that growl echoing in her ears. Not with the cold pressing in from all sides. "Toby," she yelled, her voice cracking in the silence. "Toby? Where the hell are you?" The growl came again, closer this time, louder. It was not an animal sound. It was like the very forest itself was growling, rumbling beneath the earth, and with it, something more, something darker, a whisper just beneath the growl, faint at first, but growing louder and with each second. "Get out." It was a voice, distinct, clear, but distorted by a deep, unnatural resonance. It felt like it was inside her head, in her bones. "Get out." The air around her seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Riley could see her breath hanging in the air like fog. She wasn't sure if it was the cold or the fear that had taken root in her chest, but something in the pit of her stomach told her that whatever was out there, whatever was waiting in the woods, had no intention of letting her leave. Max's voice, weak, strained, came from behind her. "Riley, come back, please." Riley spun around, her flashlight flickering wildly as it swept across the trees. But the forest was silent again, the echoes of the growl fading. She could hear Max, his voice growing louder, more panicked, but something had shifted. Something inside her told her that it was already too late. "Toby?" she whispered. She didn't know if she was calling for him anymore, or if she was calling for herself, hoping that somehow, by some miracle, she could find her way out of this dark place. Max's voice came again, louder now, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from another world. "Please, just come back." Riley's heart hammered against her ribs, its erratic rhythm only made worse by the overwhelming sense of panic that flooded her chest. She could barely focus on the path ahead. There was only the feeling of eyes on her, watching from the darkness. The trees around her seemed to close in, their branches like hands reaching out, clawing at her, tugging her deeper into the forest. Max's voice still echoed through the trees, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. Something else. Something was calling to her, a low hum that thrummed through the earth, vibrating up through her feet. The ground itself seemed to pulse underfoot, almost as if it were breathing. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, the weight of the forest bearing down on her. She spun around once more, her flashlight now a feeble beam in the all-encompassing darkness. "Max?" she called, but her voice sounded weak, swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence of the woods. Her own words came back to her distorted, warped, like a broken echo, and the blood in her veins ran cold. A snap of a branch, too loud, too sharp, brought her attention back to the path ahead, and for a moment she thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye. Something tall, cloaked in shadows, just beyond the reach of her light. But when she swung the beam of her flashlight toward it, there was nothing there. Just a twisted mass of trees and underbrush that stretched endlessly in all directions. Get out! The whisper. It was there again, sliding under her skin, curling around her thoughts like a snake, suffocating her. She gritted her teeth and pushed forward, forcing her legs to move, even as her body screamed for her to turn back. It wasn't just fear now. It was a sense of urgency, a need to get away from whatever was hunting her. Something was waiting. She could feel it. Then, another rustle. Closer this time. Louder. "Toby?" she called, her voice shaking with a mixture of desperation and frustration. There was no response, but the sound, the growl, deeper this time, rumbled from the trees again, like something massive stirring in the darkness. Riley stumbled forward, breath ragged, the flashlight trembling in her grip as she fought against the pull of the forest, the weight of the night closing in around her. And then she heard it, a sound that froze her to the spot. Laughter. It was soft at first, almost too faint to be sure of, but it came again, this time louder, closer, like a mocking, cruel thing. Riley's pulse quickened, her breath shallow and uneven as her hand shot out to steady herself against a nearby tree. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to look around. The laughter wasn't coming from Max. It wasn't coming from any person at all. It came from the trees. The laughter echoed through the air in jagged bursts, a low, mocking cackle that seemed to move from one direction to another, always just out of reach. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, but there was no one there. No one except the trees, their twisted branches swaying gently in the unnatural silence. The darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, and with it came the unmistakable feeling that she wasn't alone. The growl returned, louder now, rising in pitch, its sound rattling in her bones. Something was coming, something moving through the forest, closer with each passing second. She turned, nearly tripping over a fallen branch, and she ran, her feet crashing through the undergrowth, the beam of her flashlight slashing the darkness like a sword. In the distance, she saw the faint glow of the campfire. Maximum. Max is still there. Riley pushed herself harder, her legs burning with the effort, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stumbled through the dense trees, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind screaming for her to stop, to turn around, but she couldn't. Not until she found Max. Not until she found out what was happening here. A moment later, she burst back into the clearing, her lungs raw with effort. She looked around frantically, her flashlight scanning the area. No Max. The fire, once bright and warm, was nothing more than a flickering pile of dying embers. The logs had fallen apart, the flames guttering and struggling against the sudden encroaching cold. But the fire wasn't what terrified her. What terrified her was the silence. The camp was empty, completely, utterly empty. Max was gone. Max. Her voice trembled, barely audible, but it felt like it had been swallowed whole by the forest. There was no reply, no rustling in the trees, no crackling of the fire, just silence. The silence that came before something terrible. Her heart thudded in her chest as she rushed to the campsite, her eyes wild with panic, searching every corner of the clearing. But there was no sign of him, no sign of anything except the abandoned campfire, the charred remains of their meal, and the eerie stillness that clung to the air. And then, the whisper, "It's too late." Riley froze. The voice was no longer distant, no longer faint. It was right beside her. Slowly, she turned toward the sound. The darkness behind her seemed to open up, like the forest itself was parting to reveal something hidden. And there, in the shadows, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal either. It was something other. The creature, or whatever it was, stepped into the dim light of the campfire. Riley's breath caught in her throat as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. It wasn't quite humanoid. Its shape was wrong, stretched in ways that didn't make sense, as if it had been pulled and twisted from the very fabric of the night itself. Its body was made of shadows, flickering and shifting like smoke, but beneath that, Riley could see the glimmer of something else, something old and broken. Its limbs were long and gangly, its face obscured in darkness, but its eyes were glowing, bright, burning. They seemed to pierce straight through her, cutting into her soul with an intensity that made her knees buckle. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. It was like the creature had frozen her in place, trapped her with its gaze. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the crackling of the fire. Then slowly, the thing began to move toward her, its limbs bending in ways that were unnatural, twisting and contorting with each step. Its eyes never left hers. "It's too late," the whisper repeated, the voice now echoing in her head. Riley's pulse raced, her vision blurring. She tried to take a step back, but her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature lunged. Riley barely had time to react. The creature lunged, its body twisting in ways that were physically impossible, its shadowed limbs snaking through the air like some grotesque parody of a human form. In that split second, before the world fell away, she saw its eyes again, those glowing orbs of burning malice that seemed to pierce straight through her, weighing down her soul. She stumbled backward, her heart thundering in her chest, her pulse a deafening drumbeat in her ears. But she was too slow. It was too fast. The creature's hand, if it could be called a hand, shot forward, its long, spindly fingers curling like claws. The air around her turned cold, freezing, like she had stepped into the grip of death itself. Its touch was a shock of icy terror that sent a jolt of paralysis through her body. It felt like a fist around her heart, squeezing, suffocating her. She tried to scream, to fight, but her voice caught in her throat. Her body, too heavy to move, too rigid with fear, refused to obey. All she could do was stare into those eyes, those awful, endless eyes, and wait for the darkness to swallow her whole. But then, just as the creature's hand closed around her throat, its cold fingers tightening, there was a flash, a flicker of light, a strange crackling sound that echoed through the trees, and the creature recoiled. For a moment, Riley wasn't sure what had happened. Had she imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? She couldn't tell. Her senses were too disoriented, her mind still tangled in the web of terror that the creature had spun around her. But then she saw it, a figure standing between her and the creature, tall and imposing, blocking her from its reach. Maximum, he was standing there, his body twisted at an odd angle, as if he had been caught in mid-motion. But his presence was unmistakable. He was holding something in his hands, a long, jagged piece of wood, like a makeshift spear, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. For a moment, Riley felt a surge of hope, a flicker of recognition. "Max!" she gasped, her voice hoarse, raw. Max didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes, those wild, frantic eyes, were locked on the creature, the raw fear in his expression matching her own. He thrust the makeshift weapon forward, its tip glowing brighter now, casting an eerie light across the clearing. The creature hissed, a sound like a snake caught in a trap, its shadowed form flickering and warping. It snarled, twisting its body in unnatural ways, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it lunged again, faster this time, its claws extended, aiming for Max. Max swung the makeshift weapon in a desperate arc, catching the creature's hand just as it reached for him. The air seemed to crackle with a burst of energy, and the creature let out an ear-piercing screech, a sound that vibrated in Riley's bones. It was as if the forest itself shuddered in response. The trees groaned, their trunks bending and creaking like they were alive, shifting around them, closing in on the clearing. The sky overhead seemed to darken further, the shadows stretching and growing, smothering the last remnants of light. But Max didn't stop. He kept fighting, swinging the weapon again and again, each strike hitting with the force of a thunderclap. But the creature seemed unfazed. It was like the darkness itself was feeding off their fear, growing stronger with every failed attempt to drive it back. Riley felt herself gasping for breath as the world spun around her. She needed to move. She needed to do something, but her legs were frozen, her body locked in place by terror. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to escape, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the nightmare unfolding before her. And then she heard it again, the growl, that deep, resonant growl that had haunted the woods since they first arrived. But this time, it wasn't coming from the creature. It was coming from all around them. The ground beneath her feet rumbled, a low, rumbling tremor that vibrated through the soles of her boots. The trees shifted again, their branches twisting like serpents, bending unnaturally toward Max and the creature. The sky above was now a deep, unholy black. No stars, no moon, just darkness, pure and suffocating. Riley's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at the sky. Something was wrong. Something had gone horribly wrong. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing roar of the forest. "We need to get out of here. This place, this thing, it's not just the forest. It's the land itself. It's cursed." Max didn't hear her, or didn't listen. He was too focused on the creature, too fixated on fighting it off with his ragged, trembling weapon. The creature, however, seemed to be feeding on his fear, its movements becoming more erratic, more desperate, as if it were trying to pull him deeper into the dark. It was like a sickening dance of violence, the two of them locked in a deadly struggle for control, neither one willing to back down. The growl deepened, rising in pitch, as though something larger, more monstrous was coming. The trees around them groaned louder, and the ground beneath Riley's feet buckled. She gasped as the forest seemed to come alive, its roots and branches twisting together, forming an unnatural barrier around them. It was as if the trees themselves had turned against them, holding them in place, trapping them in the clearing. The creature screeched again, louder this time, its shape flickering and distorting in the air. It was getting stronger. Whatever power it drew from the forest, from the land itself, was growing exponentially. Riley felt it, the weight of the curse, pushing down on her chest like an iron fist. She was suffocating, trapped not just in the woods, but in the very fabric of the nightmare they had awoken. Max swung the weapon one last time, the glowing tip flashing with an eerie light, but the creature dodged, its form twisting into something unrecognizable, something wrong. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a living nightmare, a distortion of everything that was natural, an entity that existed only to consume, to destroy. Riley's body moved before her mind could catch up. She bolted toward Max, desperate to reach him before the creature did. But the moment her feet hit the ground, she felt it, a pull, like the very earth was dragging her down, sucking her into its depths. Her legs went numb, her vision blurred, and with a final, desperate cry, she felt herself fall into the darkness. Riley's mind struggled to grasp the fragments of reality that slipped through her fingers like sand. Her body was heavy, too heavy, as though the earth itself had become a weight she could no longer carry. The darkness pressed down on her, a suffocating blackness that wrapped itself around her chest and squeezed. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. There was only the pull, that relentless, crushing pull that dragged her deeper into the ground, deeper into the earth that seemed to throb with life. She tried to scream, but her mouth wouldn't work. Her throat was dry, and her limbs felt as though they had been turned to stone. She couldn't move. Her eyes fluttered open, and she found herself staring into the blackness of the forest, the twisted trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The branches moved, swaying, but it wasn't the wind. No, it was something else, something alive. And then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole, she felt it, a jolt, a violent sudden shock that ran through her body, snapping her from the fog of fear that had clouded her mind. Her legs jerked forward, and her arms shot out, finding purchase in the cold, damp earth. She gasped for air, her lungs burning as she struggled to drag herself back to the surface. But it wasn't just her body that was moving. Something was pulling her, dragging her. Someone was pulling her. Maximum. She blinked, her vision still blurred. But there he was, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes wide with panic. He was gripping her arm, pulling her up with frantic desperation, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. But his face was different now, more hollow, more empty. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, like he wasn't really seeing her, like he was looking through her into the forest itself. "Max," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Max, it's okay. We have to get out of here. We have to." But he didn't respond. He just kept pulling her, stumbling backward toward the edge of the clearing. The air was thick with the smell of rot, of decay. The forest seemed to hum with a low, unearthly energy, as though it was alive, alive in ways that no human being could ever understand. The ground beneath them shook again, the trees groaning and creaking, bending toward them with a predatory intent. Riley's breath caught in her throat as she glanced over her shoulder. The creature was still there, still watching them from the shadows, its glowing eyes burning with a hunger that made her stomach turn. It had retreated for now, but it wasn't gone. It was waiting for the moment when they would be weak enough to devour. The pull of the forest, of the curse, was stronger than ever. It clawed at her insides, making her feel like she was being torn apart from the inside out. She felt as though the very ground beneath her feet was alive, twisting and turning, trying to swallow her whole. The trees, those horrible twisted trees, seemed to be reaching for her, their branches stretching like fingers, their roots creeping up from the soil like serpents. She couldn't stop herself from looking back, and that was her mistake. A flash of movement. The creature, its form now larger, more distorted than before, surged forward from the darkness, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its body flickering between reality and nightmare. Riley's stomach lurched as it let out a screech that seemed to split the air itself, the sound tearing into her mind, clawing at her sanity. Max didn't seem to hear it. He didn't seem to see the creature at all. He kept pulling her forward, dragging her toward the trees, as though he was trying to escape something far worse than what was behind them. But Riley knew better. They couldn't outrun it. The creature was everywhere, woven into the fabric of the land, the forest, the very night itself. Her thoughts started to slip away again, like pieces of a dream fading in the light of morning. She could hear Max's voice, but it was distant now, muffled, as if he was calling to her from far away. She couldn't focus. She couldn't concentrate. She was drowning in the dark. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow in the trees. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, a figure was standing there, watching them. It wasn't a figure. It was her. Riley blinked, her body freezing in place. The woman in the shadows, it looked just like her. Same dark hair, same pale skin, same eyes. But there was something wrong about her, something off. The way she stood, motionless and still, as if she were part of the forest itself. And then slowly, the figure raised a hand, beckoning her forward. Riley's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "No, it's not real. It's not real." But the figure in the shadows didn't disappear. It waited. Riley's eyes locked onto the figure, her mind whirling. She could feel the pull of it, just like the pull of the forest, just like the pull of the curse. It was drawing her in, pulling her towards something darker, something deeper. She turned back to Max, but he wasn't there. He was gone. "Max?" she called out, her voice trembling, but there was no answer. She searched the clearing frantically, but the trees were silent. The forest seemed to have swallowed him whole. Gone. A hollow emptiness filled her chest. Gone. But that wasn't what terrified her. No, what terrified her was the whisper. No, the roar that filled her ears. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was everything. The forest, the trees, the earth beneath her. It was all alive. Alive in a way that was not natural, not human. And that figure, the one that looked like her, was still there, still waiting. A sickening realization twisted in Riley's gut. She was the one being hunted, not Max. Her. The trees, the ground, the creature. It was all tied together. They had all been drawn here by something far older than any of them could understand. And now, they were part of it. Riley turned her back to the shadows and ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to run. Her breath was a ragged gasp in her chest, the cold air burning her lungs. Her legs were cramping, her vision spinning, but she couldn't stop. She had to survive. She had to. But the world around her was distorting. The trees bent in unnatural angles, their trunks twisting into grotesque shapes. The ground beneath her feet shifted, pulling her this way and that, like the very earth was conspiring against her. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and she fell. She tumbled headfirst into the earth, the forest closing in around her, the shadowy figure waiting just beyond her reach. And then the darkness took her. The trees were taller than they'd ever seen them before. Dark, looming figures standing like sentinels over the campfire. The fire crackled, casting its orange glow across the group of friends, each of them trying to ignore the weight of the forest pressing in around them. There was a sense of quiet, of a stillness that hadn't been there when they first arrived. The woods had been inviting when they'd walked in, stretching endlessly with promises of adventure. But now, under the dim light of the stars, there was something unsettling about it. They sat in a loose circle around the fire, the sounds of the crackling wood and the occasional rustle in the trees filling the silence. The walkie-talkies, spread out on the ground between them, crackled occasionally, like the woods themselves were whispering something they couldn't understand. They had been on plenty of camping trips before, but none of them had ever felt like this. The air was thick with humidity, and the dense canopy of trees above them kept the night much darker than any of them had expected. A thick fog had rolled in from the lake a few hours earlier, swirling around their tents and making the forest feel smaller, like the edges were closing in. I thought this was supposed to be a relaxing trip, one of them muttered, glancing nervously at the flickering fire. Relaxing? Another friend laughed, his voice hollow, almost nervous. You picked the place, the middle of nowhere. They all chuckled, but the sound was strained, not quite right. No one had mentioned the fog earlier, but they'd all noticed it now. It felt as though the trees were watching them, waiting. Anyway, one of them, who had been trying to change the subject for the past few minutes, grabbed a walkie-talkie and clicked it on. Let's just check in. Make sure everyone knows we're not lost out here. They'd been using the walkie-talkies for the last few hours, keeping in touch as they set up their tents, gathered wood, and built their fire. It was supposed to be an adventure, just the five of them, far from civilization, deep in the heart of the woods. They were comfortable with each other, familiar. But now, with the air growing colder and the forest seeming so much more alive, the radios didn't seem so comforting anymore. One by one, the friends picked up their walkie-talkies, flicking them on with a quiet click. The first static burst was almost deafening, but it died down quickly. The forest seemed to lean in, as though holding its breath. "This is Nash," came the voice over the static, deep and firm, one of their own. "Just checking in. Who's still up?" One by one, the voices filtered in. Brock, Alina, Jake. Each of them gave their check-ins, saying everything was fine, the fire was going strong, and they were all just trying to enjoy the night. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to worry about. Then it came again, the crackle, louder than before, scratching at the edges of their hearing. A voice, but it wasn't one of theirs. "Help me." It was faint at first, a whisper caught in the static, barely audible. They all froze, turning to look at each other. They weren't sure what they had heard, if anything at all. Nash, who had been the one to speak first, clicked his radio again. "Hello?" His voice was thick with a mix of confusion and apprehension. "Who's out there?" The static continued for a moment, longer this time. The woods seemed quieter now, the wind muffled, as if the world itself had paused. "Help me," came the voice again, louder this time, though still weak. There was a distinct tremor to it, a tremor that sent chills down Nash's spine. "Who the hell is that?" Brock asked, his voice a low rasp as he glanced nervously at the others. They all exchanged uneasy looks. There was no one else around, no other campers, no hikers, no other voices. "Is this a prank?" Elena asked, her brow furrowing. She picked up her walkie-talkie and clicked the button to speak. "Hey, come on, who's messing around? It's not funny." But the voice didn't stop. "Lost in the woods. I'm so cold." The voice was distant but clear, as though someone was standing right behind them, yet there was no one there. It wasn't someone from their group. It was a man. Jake, who had been quiet until now, shifted nervously in his seat. Where's that coming from? Nash tightened his grip on his walkie-talkie, his knuckles going white. There's no one else out here. There's no one else with us. Elena's eyes darted nervously to the woods, her gaze searching the edge of the campfire's glow. But there was nothing, only the endless dark trees. The voice didn't respond to their calls. Instead, it faded into static, leaving only the crackling of the radio. They sat there for a long time, the group falling into an awkward silence as they each stared into the fire. A low wind began to blow, rustling the leaves around them. It seemed to grow stronger, and with it, the air grew colder. After a few moments, Nash clicked his radio again. "Who are you? Where are you? Answer me." But there was only silence, thick and heavy, the kind of silence that filled up the space between them and smothered their thoughts. The fire crackled louder, but the tension only grew. There was something off about the voice, something that didn't sit right. Brock ran a hand through his hair and glanced at the others. "It's probably just some weird glitch in the radios. You know how these things are. They pick up other frequencies." Elena shook her head slowly. "I don't know. That sounded real, like someone was out there." Nash grimaced, staring down at the radio in his hand. "I'm going to keep trying to reach them," he muttered. "Maybe they need help." He lifted the radio again, clicking it on. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Static. Nothing. A long, drawn-out silence. The voice didn't come back again that night, but they all felt it linger. Later, after hours had passed, and they sat together around the dying embers of the fire, none of them spoke about it directly, but the unease was palpable. The air was thick with it. It was almost as though the forest itself had heard the voice and now watched them with a heavy, unblinking gaze. The next morning, when the fog was still heavy and the sun struggled to rise through the trees, they all decided it was time to leave. They packed their tents and gathered their things, but the unease didn't go away. And then, just as they were about to leave the campsite, Nash heard it again. The walkie-talkie crackled. It was faint, but it was there. "Help! Me!" Nash froze. His heart skipped a beat. They were still out there, still calling, but there was no one left to answer. The voice, soft and terrified, hung in the air like a warning. "I'm still lost." The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. Whoever, or whatever, was speaking to them wasn't just lost. They were dead. They had been for years, and now they weren't alone. The realization hit Nash like a blow to the chest. Whoever, or whatever, was speaking to them wasn't just lost. They were dead. They had been for years, and now they weren't alone. He stared down at the walkie-talkie in his hand. The static still crackled softly, as if the radio itself was trying to hold on to something, some connection to the other side of the woods. He didn't know how much time had passed since that first eerie voice had come through, but the night felt endless, like the trees themselves were watching, waiting. "Did you hear that?" Elena's voice broke through the heavy silence. She was standing close, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. She hadn't been the one to hear it first, but there was no mistaking the dread in her voice. They'd all felt it. Whatever had spoken through the radio, whatever had haunted them, was not something that could be easily dismissed. The thought of it hung over them like a storm cloud. Nash's hand shook slightly as he clicked the radio again. The crackling static swirled in the air like an omen. He listened for any trace of the voice, but there was only a suffocating silence, thick with the weight of what they had just heard. "Who are you?" he said into the radio, his voice a mix of desperation and disbelief. "Answer me. Where are you?" The only reply was the sound of his own voice echoing back at him, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. "Stop messing around, Nash," Brock said, his voice low and nervous. He stood at the edge of the camp, glancing over his shoulder at the trees. "This isn't funny anymore." Nash lowered the radio and turned to face his friend. Brock's face was hard to read. Anger, confusion, maybe fear. He didn't want to admit it, but there was something in his eyes that told Nash he felt it too. The chill creeping down his spine, the sensation that the forest was closing in around them. "I'm not messing around," Nash replied, his voice tight. He could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. "I'm not the one who... His words trailed off as the sound of the radio filled the air again, faint but unmistakable. The voice, that whispering, broken sound, like a man calling from the grave. "I'm still out here. Help me." It was clearer this time. The voice carried a haunting sorrow, as if the man's soul had been trapped in those woods for years, crying out for release. Nash's breath caught in his throat. The others froze. Brock and Elena exchanged a look, both of them grimacing as the weight of the voice settled over them. "Who was that?" Brock asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Who's really out there?" Nash's fingers tightened on the walkie-talkie. The sense of panic was starting to settle in, creeping up his spine like a shadow. He wanted to say something, anything to reassure them, but he couldn't. The truth was, he didn't know what they were dealing with. Elena stepped closer, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's not just a prank. That's real." Jake, who had been standing silent for most of the night, suddenly stepped forward. "We need to leave," he said, his voice steady, though there was a hard edge to it now. "This whole place feels wrong." Nash didn't disagree. He wanted to leave, to get in the car and drive far away, but something kept him rooted to the spot, as if the woods themselves were holding him there. The voice on the radio, the man who had called out from the static, wasn't just an anomaly. There was something deeper, something they hadn't yet understood, something pulling them in. "I'm calling it," Brock said. "We pack up, get the hell out of here. Now." His words were sharp, but his eyes were darting around the campsite as though expecting something to jump out of the shadows. Elena nodded quickly, her hand shaking as she gathered her things. She wanted to leave, but a part of her wouldn't, leave the question unanswered. Who was that man? Why was he out there? Nash raised the walkie-talkie again. "Hello?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "We're leaving. If you need help, we could..." He cut off suddenly as a loud crack echoed through the woods, so sharp and close that it made everyone jump. "Help me!" The voice came again, but it was different this time. Louder, more frantic. It seemed to shriek through the crackling radio, a raw sound full of terror and urgency. Nash's heart leapt into his throat. "Get inside the tents," Jake barked, his eyes wide with panic. "Now!" They all scrambled for cover, their movements frantic and clumsy. Brock rushed to his tent, Elena just behind him. Nash hesitated, looking down at the walkie-talkie in his hand, the static still hissing in his ears. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't understand why he felt so drawn to it, so compelled to keep listening. "I'm still here." The voice grew stronger, but Nash barely registered it anymore. He couldn't focus on it, not with the air growing colder around him, not with the whispering trees pressing in. He stepped back toward his tent, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, his gut twisting with a sickening feeling of dread. The wind picked up suddenly, making the trees sway violently, as if the forest itself was stirring to life. A low, groaning sound rose from the trees, and Nash felt a deep, primal fear rise in his chest. He wasn't sure what was happening, but something was wrong, deeply wrong. Then, as if on cue, the sound of footsteps broke the silence, the unmistakable crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. The others froze, their eyes wide with fear. The forest had gone unnervingly still for a moment, but now the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, moving just beyond the edge of the camp was getting closer. "What was that?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Nash's heart hammered in his chest as he grabbed the walkie-talkie again. He clicked it on, his breath shallow. "Hello? Who's there?" he called, trying to mask the panic in his voice, though it was impossible to hide. The radio crackled in response, but this time, the voice wasn't the only thing that came through. The unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the other side of the camp. Not on the walkie-talkie, not in the static, but here, in the woods, getting closer. "I'm here. I'm not alone anymore." The voice, now frantic and desperate, sent a ripple of terror through Nash's body. It was coming closer. Before he could react, the footsteps stopped. And then, from the dark edge of the camp, something, or someone, moved into view. Before he could react, the footsteps stopped. And then, from the dark edge of the camp, something, or someone, moved into view. Before he could react, the footsteps stopped. And then, from the dark edge of the camp, something, or someone, moved into view. The figure was barely a silhouette, shrouded in the thick fog that had rolled in during the night, its shape hazy against the inky backdrop of trees. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, with a gaunt, skeletal frame that seemed to sway in the fog like a ghost from a half-remembered nightmare. Nash couldn't make out any details at first, just the outline of a person, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were struggling against some invisible force. The air around them felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in a single moment. His breath came in shallow bursts, like a man who had run too far, too fast. Who's there?" Nash called out, his voice shaking despite his efforts to sound confident. He stepped back, his mind spinning with confusion and terror. It wasn't one of their group. They had all retreated to their tents, except for him. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to acknowledge Nash's presence. Instead, It kept moving, dragging itself forward, its movements jerky and almost twitching, like a marionette with frayed strings. Every step it took was slow and deliberate, but there was no sound, no crunch of leaves or snap of twigs, only the softest whisper of movement through the dense mist. Nash's heart pounded in his chest. The radio in his hand crackled again, and this time it wasn't just static. "Help me." The voice, the same voice from earlier, now muffled and hollow. It wasn't just coming from the radio anymore. It was as if the voice was in the air itself, swirling around them, echoing through the trees. Nash's throat tightened, his pulse racing in his ears. The figure continued to approach, its body still a shadow, its limbs stretched too long and too thin. "Who are you?" Nash asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt the weight of his question in the thick fog, like it was hanging in the air with no way to escape. The figure stopped just beyond the ring of firelight, its form still an indistinct blur. Nash couldn't make out its face, but he could feel its presence, cold, empty, dead. It was as if it wasn't entirely there, as if it was nothing more than a fragment of some broken memory. And yet there was something undeniably human about it, a figure lost, struggling in the dark. "Who's out there?" Brock's voice cut through the silence from his tent, shaky but loud enough to be heard. Nash didn't respond. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the figure, his limbs frozen in place, caught between fear and some deep, gnawing curiosity. The radio in his hand crackled again, this time louder, the static hissing like the breath of something dying. The figure jerked forward, almost stumbling, and Nash instinctively took a step back, his hands trembling. He raised the radio once more, his fingers numb from the cold. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse now, cracking at the edges. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. It only stared, or at least Nash thought it was staring. The darkness had taken its face, replacing it with an empty void, a black space where eyes should have been. Nash could feel something pulling at him, something terrible and magnetic. And then, with a sudden movement, the figure stepped forward again, but this time it didn't stop. It lunged. Nash stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of a fallen log, sending him sprawling to the ground. The radio slipped from his hand, clattering against the dirt. He looked up just in time to see the figure above him, towering and cold. Its arms reached down, long, too long, and its fingers, skeletal, decayed, scraped against the air as if trying to touch him. And then the voice, closer now, no longer coming from the walkie-talkie. "You're not alone anymore," Nash gasped, his breath catching in his chest. The figure touched him, not with hands, but with a cold, overwhelming presence. His skin crawled, a prickling sensation running across every inch of him. The air itself seemed to darken, the very trees bending in toward them, as if they, too, were closing in, becoming a part of whatever nightmare had stepped into their camp. "No!" Nash screamed, pushing himself away from the figure. He scrambled backward, pulling himself up to his feet, his eyes darting wildly around the camp. He needed to get out. He needed to. The figure remained standing where it had been, unmoving. It tilted its head to the side, as if watching him, waiting. Its eyes, or what was left of them, were dark pits, like two empty sockets in a skull. And from those eyes came a deep, suffocating cold that made the air around Nash feel thick and unbreathable. And then, as if the nightmare were finally growing tired of its own game, The figure stepped backward, vanishing once again into the fog. It didn't retreat with any sense of haste, but rather with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator stalking its prey. Nash's heart was still pounding as he stumbled toward his tent. His thoughts were in chaos, his mind grasping at any explanation it could find, but there was nothing that could make sense of what he had just seen. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't human. It had no right to be here, no right to move like that, to make those sounds. He grabbed the radio from the ground, his fingers trembling as he clicked it on. "Who are you?" he asked again, this time his voice shaking with both fear and something else, desperation. The silence that followed felt suffocating, heavier than the mist that clung to the trees. The radio hissed and crackled in his hand, a sound so violent and jagged that it seemed to cut through his chest. And then, just as he thought the nightmare had ended, the voice came back. This time, it was no longer a whisper. "I'm not alone anymore." The voice sounded louder, closer, as if it had come directly from the other side of the walkie-talkie. Nash's blood ran cold, and then the walkie-talkie clicked off. He held it in his hand, feeling the pulse of something sinister, of something that shouldn't exist, rip through him. It was the radio. It was pulling them in. The figure had been real, but it wasn't alone. Nash's pulse thundered in his ears. And the worst part? Whatever it was out there, it was still watching, still waiting. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The voice sounded louder, closer, as if it had come directly from the other side of the walkie-talkie. Nash's blood ran cold, and then the walkie-talkie clicked off. He held it in his hand, feeling the pulse of something sinister, of something that shouldn't exist, rip through him. It was the radio. It was pulling them in. The figure had been real, but it wasn't alone. Nash's pulse thundered in his ears. And the worst part? Whatever it was out there, it was still watching, still waiting. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. He stumbled back to his tent, his head spinning with an adrenaline-fueled panic. His fingers felt cold and numb around the radio, and every small sound in the woods seemed amplified, like the trees were alive and whispering their secrets. He wanted to shout for the others, to tell them what had happened, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain something like this? Elena was the first to emerge from her tent, her face pale, her hair wild from sleep. "What the hell just happened?" she demanded, her voice sharp with anxiety. Brock and Jake followed closely behind her, their faces equally tense, their eyes scanning the woods. There was no more laughter in their voices now, no more joking. Whatever had just unfolded around them had wiped that away in an instant. "It came back," Nash said hoarsely, his voice tight with fear. It was standing right there, in the fog. He paused, trying to steady his breathing, but his chest felt too tight. "It's still out there, and it's not alone." "What do you mean, not alone?" Brock's voice was low, demanding, his eyes narrowing as he processed Nash's words. I don't know," Nash admitted, his eyes darting toward the woods. The fog had thickened even more, creeping into their camp like a suffocating blanket. I heard it again. The voice. It wasn't just on the radio this time. It was in the air. His words were shaky, but they felt too real. It said, "I'm not alone anymore." Jake's face hardened, his gaze flitting nervously toward the trees. "So, what are we supposed to do now? We can't just sit here and wait for whatever that thing was to come back." Alina stepped closer, her face pale, but her voice steady. "We need to get out of here. Now. I don't think we can just leave," Nash said, his voice low and tense. The idea of running felt like a bad dream, but it was also the only thing that made sense. He had a horrible gut feeling that they weren't going to escape this. Whatever that thing is, it's toying with us. His words hung in the air like a dark omen, and none of them spoke for a long time. It felt as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole, every movement, every sound muffled by the oppressive silence that now surrounded them. "What the hell is going on?" Elena finally whispered, as if speaking louder would break the fragile barrier between them and the nightmare. "How is any of this real?" "It's real, all right," Nash said grimly. He stood in the center of their camp, staring into the thickening fog. "It's real, and it's not just some glitch on the radio. I'm telling you, something's out there, something that shouldn't be." They all fell silent again, each of them staring at the woods, each of them listening for the slightest hint of movement. Footsteps, the whisper of the wind, the rustling of leaves, anything, but the silence remained unbroken. "Help me." The voice came again, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It seemed to drift in from the trees, carried on the shifting fog, as if it was calling out to them, drawing them in. Nash's stomach twisted at the sound of it, at the way it seemed to crawl under his skin, reaching into his bones. "That's it," Brock said, his voice shaky now too. "I'm done. I'm leaving. I don't care what's out there." "You can't just leave," Jake replied, his voice low and tense. "If we leave now, we might not make it out of the woods. It's too risky. We need to stick together." The voice called out again, louder this time, as if it had been waiting for them to make up their minds. The static on the walkie-talkie flared again, buzzing and crackling like a warning. It wasn't the sound of a normal transmission either. This was something else, something that crawled through the air like a living thing. "You're not alone anymore." The voice echoed from every direction, spinning in the air around them, and then it stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the radio and the oppressive silence of the forest closing in. But then, something else happened. A sound. A loud crack, sharp and sudden, came from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't a branch breaking, or the wind shifting the trees. It was too forceful, too deliberate. The sound was followed by more footsteps, but this time they weren't distant. They were close, closer than before. Nash's breath caught in his throat. He could hear them. Footsteps dragging along the forest floor. Slow, relentless. "Do you hear that?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Nash nodded, his hand shaking as he gripped the walkie-talkie tightly. His mind raced. He wanted to say something, anything, but the fear that gripped him left him speechless. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer, and they had no way of knowing what it was, or how to stop it. They all stood in a frozen circle, eyes darting nervously, hands hovering over the radios. Every sound seemed to make their hearts pound faster. The air was thick with dread, each passing second stretching into eternity. The footsteps stopped again, and then the fog shifted. Nash barely had time to register the movement before someone, stepped into the firelight. At first, he thought it was just the mist playing tricks on him. But as the figure moved forward, the truth became clear. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was a thing, a nightmare stitched together from shadow and fog. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and twisted in a way that defied nature. It had long, spindly limbs that reached out like claws, its body gaunt and malformed. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was nothing more than a stretched mass of skin, pale, hollow, its mouth open wide in a scream that could never be heard. The figure's eyes, if they could be called eyes, were nothing but hollow pits. They were the same dark void that Nash had seen before, the same pits of emptiness that seemed to swallow everything around them. The thing took a step forward, and the radio crackled in Nash's hand. "Help me." The voice was louder now, sharper, and Nash knew, with terrifying certainty, that it wasn't asking for help anymore. It was demanding it. The thing took a step forward, and the radio crackled in Nash's hand. "Help me." The voice was louder now, sharper, and Nash knew, with terrifying certainty, that it wasn't asking for help anymore. It was demanding it. The figure stood just beyond the firelight, its twisted shape looming like something from a waking nightmare. Nash couldn't tear his eyes away, even though every inch of him screamed to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But there was no running now. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself had grown tighter, more oppressive. The fog had started to shift in unnatural ways, swirling around the figure's body as though it were alive and hungry. The trees, once still, now seemed to lean in closer, their branches twisting and contorting, creating a canopy of shadow that blocked out the stars. The world felt wrong, out of balance. Elena gasped softly behind him, and Nash heard Brock's breath hitch, but neither of them dared move. All of them were frozen, their gazes locked on the creature that had appeared from the depths of the night. It stood there, silent, watching them with its hollow, empty gaze, its face stretched and malformed, its mouth hanging open like a wound that had never healed. Is it real?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling. "It's not real," Brock muttered, shaking his head as if trying to clear away some lingering nightmare. It can't be, but Nash knew better. He had felt it, the cold. He could see the mist swirling around the thing, and he could hear the voice, faint but insistent, still crackling through the static of the walkie-talkie in his hand. It wasn't just a hallucination or some strange trick of the mind. It was something darker, something born from the woods itself. The creature took another step forward, and Nash felt his stomach tighten. It was getting closer, too close. "Help me." The voice was softer now, almost pleading, but it still carried that same sharp edge, like a blade, cutting into their minds, their hearts. It was the same voice, but something had changed. It wasn't asking for help now. It was begging for something more. Nash's hands clenched around the radio, his knuckles turning white. There had to be a way to stop this, to fight it off. But how? How could they fight something that was born from the darkness itself? "What the hell do we do?" Brock finally whispered, his voice cracking. "We can't just stand here. We can't." "Run," Jake said suddenly, his voice low but filled with urgency. "We run. We leave now." But the words barely left his mouth before the air shifted again. The mist seemed to pulse, swirling violently around the figure, and then, without warning, it lunged. Time seemed to slow in that moment. Nash's heart stopped. He couldn't move. It was as though his body had been frozen, locked in place by the sheer terror of what was happening. The figure's twisted limbs reached forward, and its mouth gaped wide, revealing teeth. Not human teeth, but jagged, rotten, yellowed, and sharp. It wasn't just reaching for them. It was hungry. "No!" Nash screamed, his voice breaking. But it was too late. The thing's hand, if it could even be called a hand, shot out, grasping for Elena. She screamed, her feet stumbling as she tried to back away. But she couldn't escape the grip of the creature's cold, skeletal fingers. The world around them seemed to collapse into a tunnel of panic. The creature's eyes, if you could call them eyes, locked onto hers, and Nash could see the deep, empty void that lay within them, swallowing her whole. "No!" Nash shouted again, his body finally coming to life, moving on pure instinct. He lunged forward, but Brock grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Stop!" Brock shouted, his voice frantic. "You'll get yourself killed." But Nash didn't listen. He wrenched his arm free and ran toward Elena. He could hear her frantic sobs, could see her struggling against the creature's grip, but there was no way to break it. It was too strong, too cold. It was like trying to fight against the wind itself. Nash reached her just as the creature's fingers closed around her wrist. In a desperate panic, he grabbed the walkie-talkie and shoved it toward the thing's face. "Leave her alone," he screamed, his voice breaking with terror. For a moment, everything went silent. The creature paused, its grip slackening, but it didn't release her. It tilted its head as though studying Nash, its hollow eyes boring into him. And then, in a voice so cold it could freeze the marrow in your bones, it spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." The words made Nash's blood run cold. They weren't just spoken. They were felt deep inside his chest, vibrating in his bones. It wasn't just a warning. It was a statement, an accusation. And that was when Nash realized the awful truth. The thing wasn't lost. It wasn't trapped. It was waiting for them. Elena's scream broke Nash from his thoughts. He looked over to see her now, fully struggling, her body convulsing as if she were being pulled apart from the inside. The creature's fingers had started to melt into her skin, like they were sinking into her flesh, devouring her. She writhed in agony, her face contorted with pain as she gasped for air. "No!" Nash shouted again, but his voice was lost in the thick fog, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. "Let her go." It didn't listen. The creature didn't respond. It simply kept pulling, drawing her closer. Nash's mind raced. There was nothing he could do. No weapon, no tool, nothing. All they had was the radio, and the voice, that cold, insistent voice, was still coming through, taunting them, teasing them, pulling them closer to whatever it wanted. He looked at the others, Jake, Brock, and saw the same terror mirrored in their eyes. They couldn't stand and watch this happen. Not anymore. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice cracking, the words barely leaving his mouth before he turned and bolted into the woods. But Nash didn't follow. He couldn't. He turned back to Elena, feeling a raw, desperate pull deep within his chest, like an invisible string was tying him to her. He couldn't leave her behind. He wouldn't. But as he reached for her, a deep, guttural voice sounded again, chilling his very soul. "You cannot leave." And that was when the trees around them began to close in,